My name is Sarah. I'm 32, and this happened in the Arbuckle Mountains near Turner Falls Trail, a place that, to me, used to promise peace and beauty until it revealed a darkness I never expected. I had been yearning for an escape from the ceaseless demands of my urban life, and when my 3 closest friends, Mark, Linda, and David, proposed a reunion road trip, I couldn't refuse. Our plan was simple: leave behind the noise and neon of the city, rent an old RV, and venture into the backwoods for a weekend of nature, laughter, and rediscovery. I thought I was prepared for the isolation, but nothing could have primed me for what lay ahead. We arrived late on a chilly Friday evening, the RV's engine coughing as it made its way down a narrow, winding road that led to a secluded RV park tucked away near the Turner Falls Trail. The park was little more than a scattering of gravel lots and rusted utility poles, and it felt abandoned by time, a forgotten patch of wilderness. Our RV, a creaking relic with a sputtering generator and outdated maps, had clearly seen better days. But we were all too excited by the promise of adventure to dwell on our shoddy equipment. Inside the RV, the atmosphere was lighthearted at first. Mark, always the thrill-seeker, joked about our vintage ride as he fiddled with the generator, determined to get it working. David, ever the cautious one, checked and rechecked our supplies, making sure that we had everything we might possibly need. Linda, whose quiet intuition often preceded the physical manifestations of nature's secrets, sat by the window, her eyes lingering on the dense forest outside as if reading hidden messages in the rustling leaves. I, naturally, took it upon myself to ensure everyone was comfortable and organized, my research into local folklore a constant undercurrent in my mind. The night began benignly enough. We set up a small campfire outside the RV, gathered around its flickering light as we shared stories from our lives. The stars above shone so brightly that it seemed as though the heavens themselves were peering down at our reunion. Yet, as the temperature dropped and the fire's warmth struggled against the encroaching chill, subtle, unsettling signs began to reveal themselves. At first, it was the RV's old radio. While trying to catch a familiar station, I noticed an unusual static that morphed into what sounded like faint whispering. The voices were barely discernible, punctuated by murmurs that felt almost like native chants echoing from the depths of the forest. I brushed it off as interference, a quirk of our outdated technology, but Linda's eyes grew wide with unease as she murmured, "Do you hear that? It's like they're calling." I tried to reassure her, explaining that it was likely nothing more than a malfunction, but the doubt in my own voice betrayed my growing concern. We retired for the night with a promise to reconvene in the morning, unaware that the events of that night would shape our lives forever. In the early hours before dawn, I awoke to the sound of an eerie silence that had replaced the usual nocturnal chorus of crickets and rustling leaves. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin. The forest around the RV was dark and impenetrable, save for the faint glow of our malfunctioning RV lights that shivered in the distance. As I walked along a narrow trail leading away from the RV, my eyes caught something strange on the ground. A set of footprints that were too large to belong to any animal I knew, and too deliberate to be random. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, though the images came out blurry and indistinct. The impression was clear. Someone, or something, had been stalking our camp. The following day, we decided to explore the area. Mark, ever the daredevil, insisted on taking a short hike to check out some local petroglyphs I'd read about in a dusty old travel guide. These petroglyphs, etched into ancient rock surfaces along the trail, depicted ritualistic scenes of cannibal feasts and ominous symbols. Images that sent shivers down my spine even in the daylight. According to local legend, these carvings were connected to the tale of the Wailing Shadow, a vengeful spirit born from the dark rituals of a long-forgotten cannibal cult of indigenous peoples. Locals whispered that the spirit roamed these lands, luring unwary travelers to their doom with its mournful cries and otherworldly presence. At the sight, the air felt charged with an intensity that was hard to ignore. The worn carvings told a story of bloodshed and sorrow. As I stood there, trying to decipher the meaning behind the symbols, Mark suddenly dashed off, his curiosity getting the better of him. "I'm going to get a closer look," he called over his shoulder, his voice betraying a mix of excitement and bravado. We urged him to stay with us, but his smile was full of reckless determination, and he disappeared into the dense thicket. Not long after, when we gathered again, Mark reappeared, his clothes torn and his face smeared with dirt. His eyes were wide, filled with terror and something unspoken, an expression I would later recognize as the mark of someone who has seen the unspeakable. "There was someone, or something, following me," he stammered, barely able to articulate the horror of his encounter. It was like looking into a mirror, but twisted, like a version of me that wasn't me at all. His words sent a chill through us all. David's hands trembled, and Linda's face paled, her earlier intuitions now fully confirmed by the tangible terror in Mark's voice. The day wore on, and the initial thrill of our adventure turned to dread. Our equipment continued to fail us. Our generators sputtered intermittently, plunging us into darkness at crucial moments, and the RV's unreliable GPS led us deeper into the labyrinthine forest than we had intended. Group tensions escalated. David's constant warnings and cautious nature clashed with Mark's disregard for danger, and my attempts to keep everyone focused only served to highlight the fractures forming within our tight-knit group. Linda, whose quiet insights had once been the glue holding us together, was now a source of mounting anxiety as her premonitions grew more frequent and intense. That night, as the wind whispered secrets through the trees, our worst fears began to manifest. The RV's lights flickered and died, one after the other, as if the darkness itself was swallowing the very essence of our sanctuary. The radio, which had been an eerie companion on our first night, suddenly erupted with a cacophony of distorted voices and native chants, echoing as if to summon ancient powers from the depths of the forest. Linda, who had woken from a fitful sleep, insisted that the voices were not random. They were warnings, a desperate plea from the past. Unable to sleep, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to survey the area. That's when I saw it. A set of fresh footprints far larger and deeper than those from earlier, circling the RV in a deliberate pattern. My heart pounded as I took in the sight. They were not just random wanderings of a beast or an animal. They were calculated, as if the entity behind them was marking us, staking its claim on our territory. In the dim glow of my flashlight, I noticed something even more disturbing. A shadow moving just at the edge of the trees. It was impossible to discern any details, but the shape was humanoid, its movements slow and predatory. I called out to the others, my voice trembling with fear, but the sound of my own heartbeat drowned out my plea. In that moment, I knew that this was no mere haunting spirit or wayward ghost. It was something dangerous, something that defied our understanding of the natural world. We gathered in the RV, huddled together as we tried to make sense of the inexplicable events. I recalled the legends of the Wailing Shadow and the indigenous lore that spoke of protective rites against such malevolent forces. I had read about ancient chants and symbols that could ward off evil, and I shared these fragments of knowledge with the group, hoping to anchor us in a plan. But fear had already taken root. Mark's wild eyes and David's anxious mutterings filled the cramped space, while Linda remained silent, lost in her own troubled thoughts. As the night deepened, our situation grew more perilous. The entity outside seemed to take on a life of its own. At times, it manifested as a sorrowful, grieving figure, an indigenous soul lamenting a tragic past, its face etched with sorrow and regret. At other times, it transformed into a grotesque, shadowy monster, with eyes that glowed with a malevolent intensity, as if burning away the very light of hope. It was as if the forest itself had become a battleground for an ancient feud, one that now threatened to engulf us in its relentless fury. The terror escalated when, in a moment of terrifying clarity, the RV's structure shuddered as if struck by unseen forces. The windows trembled, and a deep, guttural howl reverberated through the night air, a sound that spoke of pain, rage, and an unquenchable thirst for retribution. In the chaos that followed, David was injured. I rushed to his side as he collapsed near the door, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. "It hit me. I saw it," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper against the cacophony of unnatural sounds outside. Mark, still reeling from his earlier encounter, could only stare in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. In that frantic moment, I knew that our survival depended on more than just physical escape. It required confronting the very essence of the supernatural terror that haunted us. Drawing on every scrap of indigenous lore I had studied, I led the group in a desperate bid to ward off the relentless force. We huddled in a tight circle inside the RV, the dim light of a single lantern casting long shadows on the walls, as I recited protective chants I'd learned from old historical records and local legends. The words felt archaic, yet they resonated with a power that seemed to momentarily push back the encroaching darkness. For what felt like an eternity, we chanted together, our voices merging in a desperate plea for salvation. The atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. The oppressive weight of the entity's presence receded, replaced by a palpable tension that held us all in suspended hope. But the reprieve was brief. The next wave of supernatural assault hit us with renewed vigor. The entity, now fully unleashed, battered the RV with unidentifiable blows that shattered our sense of security. It was violent, unpredictable, and determined to break through our fragile defenses. Outside, amidst the violent chaos, I glimpsed the figure again. A distorted, twin-like image of Mark, mirroring his every gesture with a sinister twist. It was as if the creature was a doppelganger, a perverse reflection of our own fears, and it sent a new wave of terror through my heart. I could feel the presence of the ancient curse closing in on us, an inevitable reckoning for trespassing into its domain. In that desperate hour before dawn, with the forest roaring with unholy fury and our RV groaning under the relentless assault, I made a decision. I told my friends that we needed to either commit fully to the ancient rites or surrender to the horror that lurked just beyond our fragile shelter. Mark, ever impulsive, insisted on confronting the entity head-on, while David and Linda urged caution, their voices trembling with both fear and determination. I had to find a way to reconcile these conflicting instincts, to merge my own scholarly knowledge with the raw, instinctual fear that now gripped us all. With trembling hands, I retrieved a small book of indigenous lore I had found in a local historical society. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, contained the very chants and symbols I had recited earlier. I flipped through the pages, searching for a passage that might help us banish the malevolent force. At the stroke of dawn, when the first weak rays of light began to seep into the darkness, I led my friends to the perimeter of our makeshift sanctuary. There, I arranged a circle using rocks and hastily drawn symbols on the ground, reciting the ancient words with as much conviction as I could muster. The air vibrated with energy as my voice echoed against the cold, hard earth. In that moment, I felt a connection to the indigenous ancestors who had once faced similar horrors and emerged victorious by honoring their traditions and respecting the power of the natural world. Our voices, though shaky, grew stronger as we chanted in unison. The oppressive presence outside seemed to waver, its violent onslaught momentarily suspended in a fragile truce with the ancient power we had invoked. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the violence subsided. The howls and crashes faded into the distance, leaving us in an eerie silence broken only by our ragged breathing. We looked at one another, disbelief and relief mingling in our eyes. David's injury, though painful, appeared to be stabilizing, and even Mark's wild, haunted expression softened as he realized that the worst might have passed. Yet, deep down, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. The entity, the wailing shadow, had been repelled for the moment, but its malevolent presence lingered in the corners of our vision and the depths of our nightmares. We had survived one night of terror, but the chilling memory of those ghostly footprints, the distorted doppelganger, and the violent clashes with a force beyond our understanding was etched permanently into our souls. In the following days, as the sun rose higher and the forest slowly reclaimed its silence, we packed up our damaged RV and set out on the long drive back to civilization. The experience had left an indelible mark on each of us. Mark's recklessness had nearly cost us our lives, and David's constant caution had proven a vital counterbalance to our collective fear. Linda, once so dismissed for her quiet premonitions, had been vindicated in the most harrowing of ways, her intuitive warnings serving as our early alarm bells. And I, Sarah, found myself changed, no longer the composed leader I once was, but a woman forever haunted by the echoes of ancient rites and the visceral, almost tangible presence of a force that defied explanation. Even now, months later, I struggle to reconcile the memory of that night with the rational person I once was. The legends of the indigenous peoples, the warnings of the wailing shadow, and the echoes of those ancient chants continue to whisper in the recesses of my mind. I no longer take comfort in the quiet of nature, for I know that beneath the tranquil surface, ancient forces lie in wait, ready to remind us that some secrets of the wilderness are best left undisturbed. I often find myself revisiting the petroglyphs in my thoughts, their carved symbols a permanent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded that fateful night. In the depths of the Arbuckle Mountains, among the silent witnesses of time, rocks, trees, and the lingering spirits of those who came before, our trespass had awakened something that was both violent and sorrowful, something that would continue to haunt the forgotten trails long after we were gone. Looking back, I realized that our survival depended not on brute strength or modern technology, but on an ancient wisdom that we had overlooked in our modern lives. The indigenous lore, passed down through generations, held the key to understanding the delicate balance between the natural and the supernatural, a balance that we had disrupted, only to be forced into a desperate negotiation for our very lives. That night, in the RV, with the howls of the creature echoing and the terrified faces of my friends illuminated by flickering candlelight, I learned that isolation in the wild is not merely a matter of physical distance from civilization. It is a confrontation with the ancient, primordial forces that reside in the heart of nature, forces that remain indifferent to our modern conveniences, and that awaken when we dare to intrude upon their domain. I now carry the scars of that night in more ways than one. The physical marks on our RV and the wounds that David suffered have faded, but the memories remain vivid, a constant reminder that survival in the wild is never guaranteed, and that sometimes the past reaches out to claim its due. The story of our encounter has become a silent pact among us, an unspoken understanding that we have glimpsed a realm beyond our comprehension, and that the darkness we encountered is still out there, waiting for another unwary soul. As I pen these words, the memory of that dawn still haunts me. The forest, once a symbol of escape and renewal, now stands as a monument to our ordeal. A place where the boundary between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, blurs into an endless twilight of fear and mystery. And so I live with the knowledge that some legends are true, and that sometimes the past, with all its sorrow and darkness, refuses to be forgotten. My name is Sarah. I'm 32, and that night in the Arbuckle Mountains changed me forever. Every time I hear a faint whisper on the wind or see a shadow flit across a moonlit field, I remember the lessons learned in that cursed place. I remember that survival is not just about escaping physical dangers, but about confronting the ancient truths that lie hidden in the darkness. And as long as I live, I will carry with me the chilling reminder of the night we faced the wailing shadow. A night when our modern world collided with an age-old terror that still roams the backwoods of Oklahoma. My name is Ethan. I'm 38, and this happened in the Ouachita National Forest near a clearing locals call Devil's Den, a place whose dark reputation had drawn me there in search of redemption and solitude. I'd been running from my past for years, burdened by mistakes I couldn't erase and regrets that clung to me like a shadow. My only hope was that isolation and the raw embrace of nature might help me confront the ghosts I carried within. With a battered old RV as my reluctant companion, a vehicle whose engine coughed more than it roared, I set out on a solo journey, determined to find peace in the wilderness, and perhaps even forgive myself. After a long, meandering drive, I arrived at a small, weathered RV park on the outskirts of Devil's Den. The park was a cluster of faded gravel lots surrounded by gnarled trees and thick fog, as if the land itself wished to keep outsiders at bay. The sign at the entrance, rusted and barely legible, warned of cursed grounds, but I dismissed it as local superstition, until the night fell and the wind began to whisper secrets. The RV I'd rented was nothing to boast about. Its interior was cramped, and every component seemed to protest with creaks and groans. As I set up camp, I couldn't help but notice that the navigation system was unreliable, leading me down unexpected turns that brought me closer to the notorious Devil's Den. The chill of the encroaching fog seeped through the thin walls of the RV, and I felt a familiar prickle of unease. That first evening, I decided to leave the RV for a short walk to clear my head. The ground was slick with dew, and a violent thunderstorm had been forecast, the clouds rolling in like dark armies. I wrapped myself in a threadbare jacket and stepped out into the oppressive quiet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. I paused on a ridge overlooking the park, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I strolled along a narrow, winding path, I heard odd knocks that seemed to come from the very walls of the RV, though I knew I was too far away for that to be possible. The knocks were irregular, echoing off the trees, and they sent shivers down my spine. I chalked it up to the wind, but deep down, I knew there was something more at play here. The next day, I decided to make a short trip to a nearby diner for some warmth and a hot meal. It was there that I encountered a local hermit known simply as Joe, a man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much of the land's secrets. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, he leaned in and told me, "You shouldn't be here, son. Devil's Den isn't just a name. It's a place where the past comes to haunt you. Folks say that this ground was once a sacred site for rituals long forgotten, and that the devil himself left his mark here." His words, delivered in a low, gravelly tone, left me unsettled. I'd come here to confront my inner demons, but Joe's warnings hinted that there might be something very real and malevolent lurking in the darkness, a force that could exploit my vulnerability. I thanked him for the advice, though I wasn't sure I believed it, and returned to my RV with a sense of foreboding growing in my gut. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner over a portable stove, the weather turned. A dense, choking fog descended upon the RV park, and the wind began to howl as if mourning some ancient loss. I sat in the cramped interior, trying to read a worn book of prayers my mother had once given me, when the RV's lights began to flicker erratically. For a moment, everything was bathed in an eerie, pulsating glow before the lights died entirely, plunging me into near darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the fog like a knife. That's when I saw it. A series of large footprints pressed into the damp earth around the RV. They were far too large and deliberate to belong to any animal I knew. My heart hammered in my chest as I followed their trail with trembling steps. The prints led towards Devil's Den, disappearing into the gloom of the forest. The further I walked, the more I felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes upon me. At one point, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving at the edge of my vision, a shape that seemed to merge with the darkness, only to vanish when I turned to look directly. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a trick of the light or an overactive imagination, but the sensation of being watched grew too strong to ignore. I returned to the RV with a mix of fear and determination. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, nor could I allow my doubts to paralyze me. I set about searching the area around my campsite for any more clues, and that's when I discovered an old, weathered shrine tucked away beneath a cluster of trees. The shrine was adorned with strange symbols and relics, items that hinted at a long history of occult rituals and dark ceremonies. It wasn't a place of worship in any conventional sense, but rather a memorial to something far more sinister. Back in the RV, I sat alone, staring at the shrine through a crack in the window, pondering the hermit Joe's cryptic words. Had I come to a place where the devil's very essence lingered? A force that preyed upon the weaknesses of those who dared trespass its domain. I didn't have the answers, but I knew that the night was far from over. As darkness enveloped the park once again, the supernatural began to make its presence known with increasing intensity. I heard a low guttural voice, a sound that seemed to emanate from both the earth and the sky. It was as if the wind itself carried an ancient chant, a malevolent hymn meant to unsettle even the strongest of wills. The sound was interspersed with rapid knocks against the RV, as though something was trying to break through the walls. I tried to steady my breathing and recite the prayers my mother had taught me, but the words felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming dread that now gripped me. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind slammed against the RV, and I felt the structure shudder violently. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was an orchestrated assault by a presence that was determined to make its mark on me. The next few hours were a blur of terror and desperation. I tried to barricade myself inside the RV, yet every time I thought I was safe, the disturbances would intensify. At one point, as I attempted to switch on the engine for a quick escape, I noticed a dark, shifting shape reflected in the cracked rearview mirror. A figure that looked disturbingly like a twisted version of myself, with eyes burning an unnatural red. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but it left me questioning my sanity. Was this demon a mere illusion, or was it a tangible manifestation of the devil's presence? In the midst of the storm, I gathered my courage and decided that I had to confront this malevolent force head-on. I recalled the pages of that old prayer book and the cryptic symbols on the shrine. Perhaps there was a way to harness the ancient rites and turn the tide against this supernatural adversary. With a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight, the prayer book, and a few relics from the shrine, and stepped out into the tempest. The rain pounded down, drenching me as I made my way toward Devil's Den. The fog was impenetrable, and the only sound was the relentless roar of the storm mixed with the occasional, unnerving howl that seemed to come from nowhere. I reached a small clearing where the ground was marked by the strange symbols from the shrine. There, amidst the wild, swirling elements, I began to recite the protective words my mother had once taught me, a prayer that now felt ancient and powerful in the face of this evil. As I spoke, the storm seemed to pause, as if the very fabric of nature was holding its breath. My voice, trembling yet resolute, echoed across the clearing. For a moment, the oppressive presence receded, and I felt a fragile sense of hope. But just as suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deep, mocking laugh, a sound that reverberated through my bones. From the shadows emerged the demonic figure, its form shifting between that of a tormented soul and a grotesque, horned beast. The creature's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its voice was a blend of rage and sorrow as it began to taunt me. "Ethan," it sneered, "you come seeking redemption, yet you carry nothing but guilt and regret. You are as much a prisoner of your own making as you are to this cursed place." The words stung, dredging up memories of mistakes I'd long tried to forget. The broken relationships, the opportunities squandered, the lives I'd hurt. It was as if the entity knew every dark corner of my heart. I fought back tears as I recited the protective prayer louder, my voice joining the furious chorus of the storm. The creature advanced, its every step a challenge to my resolve. A fierce struggle ensued in that desolate clearing, a battle not only of physical force but of wills and the darkest recesses of the human soul. The devil's presence hurled objects through the air. Branches, stones, even the very earth seemed to tremble with its wrath. I clutched the relics from the shrine as if they were talismans of my own salvation, each one a silent reminder of the ancient rites that might save me. Time seemed to warp as the confrontation dragged on. Each recitation of the prayer filled me with both terror and determination. I could feel my internal demons, those burdens of guilt and self-reproach, melding with the external nightmare that had materialized before me. For every word I spoke, the demonic figure recoiled, its features twisting in agony, only to surge forward again with renewed fury. At one point, the creature reached out and brushed past me, leaving an icy trail of despair on my skin. In that brutal exchange, I began to understand that the true battle was not solely against a supernatural evil, but against the inner torment that had plagued me for years. The demon was, in many ways, a mirror of my own self, a grotesque manifestation of the guilt and self-loathing that I had tried so desperately to bury. And so, with every fiber of my being, I resolved to face both sides of that terrible coin. Drawing on a strength I hadn't known I possessed, I increased the volume of my recitations. The storm, once wild and uncontrolled, seemed to gradually subside, its fury dampened by the combined force of my defiance and the ancient words that now resonated through the clearing. The demonic figure faltered, its movements growing erratic as if the very act of reciting the protective rites was weakening it. In the final, desperate moments of that night, the creature's form began to dissolve, its howl turning into a pitiful whimper that was soon lost amidst the renewed patter of gentle rain. I collapsed to my knees, soaked and trembling, my heart still pounding with the adrenaline of survival and the painful echoes of its taunts. The oppressive presence that had so long haunted Devil's Den was receding, but I knew that its mark, both on the land and on my soul, would linger for as long as I lived. In the hours that followed, as dawn broke over the horizon, I returned to the RV with a heavy, conflicted heart. The storm had left the park in disarray, but I felt an inner clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. I had confronted a force that was both external and internal, a manifestation of the devil's den and a mirror to my own past. Whether the demon was truly a separate entity or merely a projection of my own inner torment, I was no longer sure. What I did know, however, was that I had survived the night, and in doing so, I had taken the first step toward forgiving myself. I spent the remainder of that day tending to the small wounds of both my body and spirit. I scribbled notes in a battered journal, detailing every moment of that surreal encounter, every whispered taunt, and every tearful recitation of a prayer that now held a deeper meaning than ever before. The relics from the shrine, carefully wrapped and stowed away, became my silent testament to the night's ordeal, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is a glimmer of light waiting to be rekindled. By the time I packed up the RV and prepared to leave Devil's Den behind, the oppressive fog had lifted, revealing a landscape washed clean by rain. I drove away slowly, the images of that harrowing night etched permanently in my memory. I knew that the scars, both visible and hidden, would take time to heal, but I also recognized that I had faced a part of myself I had long denied. Now, as I continue my journey, I carry the lessons of Devil's Den with me. I know that redemption is not found in running away from one's past, but in confronting the darkness head-on, whether it comes from without or from within. The memory of that night serves as a constant reminder that even when the devil himself seems to be at your door, it is the strength to forgive yourself that ultimately sets you free. My name is Ethan, I'm 38, and I came to Devil's Den seeking solace. What I found was a brutal confrontation with the shadows of my own guilt, and a path, steeped in ancient rites and painful truth, toward reclaiming my life. As I drive further into the sunrise, I know that while the darkness may always linger at the edges of my mind, I now have the courage to face it, armed with the knowledge that the true enemy was never solely the demon at Devil's Den, but the despair I carried within. Every mile I travel is a reminder that redemption is a journey, a slow, relentless process of facing your inner demons, learning from the scars they leave behind, and forging a future where hope shines even in the bleakest of landscapes. And so I drive on, not as a man haunted by his past, but as one who has finally begun to understand that every shadow, no matter how dark, is chased away by the light of a new day. My name is Alice Monroe. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in the unforgiving wilds of Black Mesa, Oklahoma. I had been seeking a respite from the chaos of everyday life, a return to nature, a chance to prove to myself that I could lead a team through isolation and danger. I never imagined that our journey would plunge us into a nightmare where the ancient and the modern collided, where survival meant facing not just the harsh elements, but something far more sinister. I'd organized the expedition with high hopes and a firm belief in discipline, honed during my years in the military. My plan was to lead a small group into a remote part of Black Mesa to photograph rare wildlife and explore an abandoned homestead, a relic said to be steeped in local Native American lore. Our RV was our lifeline, though it was an aging model that coughed and spluttered on rough terrain. Outdated cameras, insufficient navigational tools, and basic camping supplies were all we had to rely on, a fact that would soon add to our growing list of problems. The group I had assembled was as diverse as it was talented. Brandon "Bran" Hayes, our resident photographer and eternal optimist, was the soul of the team. His easy humor often lightened the tension, though I sensed his underlying anxiety whenever our path took us deep into the unknown. Carmen Alvarez, a researcher with a passion for indigenous lore and the occult, was sensitive and intuitive, with an uncanny ability to sense the unexplainable. Then there was Dave Carter, an engineer whose practical, skeptical nature often clashed with the rest of us. His rationality was a bulwark against our more fanciful notions, but it also made him dismissive of anything that couldn't be measured or calculated. We set out on a chilly September morning, the rising sun casting long shadows across the rocky outcrops of Black Mesa. The RV groaned under the weight of our gear and our hopes, its engine a constant reminder of our precarious situation. As we drove along the winding dirt roads, I felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a stillness that belied the usual hustle of nature. Our destination was an old homestead on the edge of the mesa, abandoned for decades, and whispered about in local legends as a cursed place. Carmen had spent weeks poring over historical records and indigenous folklore, convinced that the homestead was a nexus of supernatural energy. According to the stories she'd gathered, a malevolent skinwalker, an entity capable of shifting shape and assuming grotesque forms, had been sighted in these parts, its origins entwined with darker rituals and even darker histories, including whispers of a cannibal cult that had once terrorized the area. By mid-afternoon, the RV had reached a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense patch of scrub, oak, and juniper. The first sign that something was amiss came when we encountered an unnatural mist that seemed to hang over the land like a shroud. It was as if the sun had been dimmed behind an opaque veil, and the once familiar landscape was transformed into something eerie and indistinct. The mist moved with a life of its own, swirling around the boulders and trees in silent, ghostly patterns. That night, as we set up camp near the homestead ruins, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The RV's interior was barely warm, and the malfunctioning heater did little to fend off the cold that crept into our bones. I sat by the flickering light of a weak lantern, trying to steady my thoughts when a soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached my ears. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on my mind, but as the night deepened, so did the voices, murmurs that carried a tone of warning, of ancient grief. The next morning, we set out to explore the homestead and the surrounding area. I led the way, trusting my instincts to navigate the labyrinth of rocky trails and abandoned structures. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and every step we took was accompanied by a sense that we were being watched. Brand's camera clicked incessantly as he documented every strange shadow and unsettling marking etched into the stone walls. Carmen, notebook in hand, recorded every detail, her eyes wide with both wonder and fear. David trailed behind, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the ground, as if searching for a rational explanation in the dirt. We soon came upon a series of bizarre carvings on an ancient boulder. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, a fusion of indigenous motifs and cryptic signs that Carmen later explained might be part of a ritual to ward off evil. But there was an unsettling familiarity to them, as if they were a warning left behind by someone who had encountered the darkness before us. It was then that I realized our equipment and supplies, already meager, would do little to prepare us for the true threat lurking in this forsaken land. That evening, as dusk settled over Black Mesa, the mist returned with renewed vigor. We gathered near the RV, our conversations hushed and our eyes darting to the encroaching fog. I remember Brand's attempt at levity, making a joke about our haunted road trip, which only elicited nervous chuckles from the group. Carmen, however, grew increasingly somber, her intuitive gaze fixed on the shifting mist as if she could see shapes and forms that we could not. David remained silent, his skeptical frown deepening with every passing minute. It was around midnight when the true horror made itself known. I was jolted awake by a series of frantic knocks at the RV door. My heart pounded as I peered through the dim light to see an indistinct figure standing just beyond the threshold. At first, I thought it was one of us, but then the figure shifted. Its form blurred and contorted into something monstrous. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal, but its eyes burned with a malevolent, unnatural light. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. There was no response, only a guttural sound that resonated with primal hunger. In that moment, the terror that Carmen had warned us about materialized before our eyes. A skinwalker, as described in the ancient legends. It was not a passive presence, but a predatory force, circling our makeshift sanctuary with a sinister grace. In the chaos that followed, our group splintered. David, ever the rationalist, argued that it must be a trick of the light or a misidentification caused by our frayed nerves. But even his voice wavered when the creature lunged at the door, its claws scraping against the metal with supernatural strength. Bran grabbed his camera and began snapping pictures frantically, his humor drowned out by the rising terror. Carmen's eyes filled with tears as she murmured incantations she'd learned from local lore, desperately hoping to appease whatever ancient spirit had been disturbed. I took command. "Everyone, stay calm and follow my orders," I barked, even as my own hands trembled. I barricaded the door with a heavy wooden plank and motioned for the others to huddle together. The creature circled outside, its presence a constant, menacing reminder that we were not alone. Every so often it would pause, as if to study us, before retreating into the swirling mists. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in suffocating silence. The creature's relentless scratching and the low, disembodied murmurs that now filled the night chipped away at our resolve. I could see the terror in each of my companions' eyes. Bran's wide-eyed wonder turned to sheer panic, Carmen's spiritual fervor turning to despair, and even David's defiant skepticism crumbling under the weight of our shared horror. Around 2 a.m, the unthinkable happened. A crash shattered the fragile silence as the creature breached our barricade. In the ensuing chaos, I scrambled to grab my sidearm, a habit ingrained in me from years of service. But in that moment, the room was consumed by pandemonium. Bran screamed as he was dragged across the floor by an unseen force, his camera clattering to the ground. Carmen's incantations grew louder, her voice a desperate plea against the encroaching darkness, but it did little to deter the relentless horror. I fought with every ounce of strength, grappling with the creature as it sought to drag me into the abyss of the night. Its eyes, burning with an unholy fire, bore into my soul. I could feel its icy touch, a reminder that this was no mere ghost or trick of the light, but a living, malevolent force of nature. In the struggle, I managed to break free, slamming the creature back against the door. But the victory was short-lived. David, trying to intervene with one of his hastily assembled alarms, was caught off guard. His rational defiance shattered as the creature's claws found him. I heard his anguished cry, and in that moment, I knew we had lost one of our own. The creature finally retreated into the mist, leaving behind a scene of devastation and heartache. We were shaken, our minds reeling from the violence we had witnessed. In the grim aftermath, the reality of our situation sank in. The supernatural force that had stalked us was not merely a passive specter, but a violent predator. It had claimed a life, and its eyes were fixed on the rest of us. As dawn broke over the Mesa, the rising sun did little to dissipate the eerie mist that still clung to the land. With heavy hearts, we gathered our scattered belongings. Carmen's hands trembled as she clutched a tattered notebook filled with indigenous symbols and rituals. her only hope of understanding and possibly appeasing the malevolent spirit. Bran, once the spark of levity, was now subdued, his usual jokes replaced by a hollow silence and haunted eyes. David lay in a makeshift cot inside the RV, bandaged and unconscious, a grim testament to our ordeal. Realizing that staying in the RV was no longer an option, I made the difficult decision to abandon it. The vehicle had served as our fragile shelter, but now it was a death trap. We gathered what little supplies we could salvage and prepared to make our escape on foot. The plan was to navigate through the maze of canyons and rocky trails, relying on my military training and Carmen's knowledge of the land. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. We set out under the fading light of dawn, our progress slowed by the treacherous terrain and our own exhaustion. The mist seemed to follow us, an ever-present reminder of the night's horrors. The landscape of Black Mesa, with its rugged beauty and hidden dangers, had transformed into a labyrinth of uncertainty. At times, I felt as if the land itself were conspiring against us, a silent accomplice to the ancient curse that had been awakened. As we journeyed deeper into the wilderness, Carmen led us to an area where the markings on trees became more frequent, each one a cryptic warning etched into the bark. She explained that these symbols were part of an ancient indigenous tradition meant to protect the people from evil spirits. But here, they seemed to be a plea, a desperate attempt by those who had come before us to warn against the malevolence that roamed these lands. By midday, our group had shrunk under the relentless strain of hunger, fear, and physical exertion. Our supplies were nearly depleted, and the relentless isolation began to erode our unity. David, whose skepticism had once been a stabilizing force, now harbored a bitter resentment toward what he called old wives' tales. His rational mind, once a beacon of reason, now seemed a fragile veneer over his mounting terror. Bran, too, was changing. His humor, once a welcome distraction, had given way to a grim determination, a silent promise that he would document every moment, perhaps as a way to make sense of the madness. As night fell once more, we found temporary refuge in a narrow canyon, its steep walls providing some semblance of protection. We made a small camp and huddled around a dwindling fire, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the rocks and the distant, mournful howl that echoed off the canyon walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the darkness itself was alive and waiting for us to let our guard down. In that fragile hour between dusk and night, Carmen shared her research with us. She told us of a local legend, a story passed down through generations of indigenous people in this region. It spoke of a cursed entity, a skinwalker born of ancient rituals and human greed, that was bound to the land by blood and sorrow. According to the legend, this creature was not merely a beast, but a harbinger of retribution, a force that preyed on those who dared disturb the sanctity of the wilderness. It was said that once it set its eyes on a soul, it would pursue it relentlessly, feeding off their fear and despair until nothing remained. Her words sent shivers down my spine. I realized then that our encounter on the night of the assault was only the beginning. The creature had marked us, and its presence was as much a part of Black Mesa as the rocky outcrops and winding trails. We could not hide from it. We could only hope to outrun its malevolence. As the night deepened, I took stock of our situation. The loss of David weighed heavily on us, and the fear of further loss tightened every muscle in my body. But I also recognized that we had to keep moving if we were to survive. I gathered Bran and Carmen close and laid out a plan. We would press on through the canyon, using the natural cover of the rocky terrain to avoid detection. We would rely on both modern ingenuity and the ancient wisdom Carmen had unearthed. It was a desperate bid for survival, but it was our only option. For the next several days, we trekked through the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Black Mesa. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every gust of wind carried an echo of the creature's sinister presence. The group's tension grew with each passing mile. Brand's camera captured haunting images of our journey, the twisted silhouettes of gnarled trees, the ghostly remnants of abandoned dwellings, and the ever-present mist that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Carmen's quiet prayers and whispered incantations filled the long nights, a futile attempt to ward off the darkness that crept ever closer. And though I maintained a facade of determined leadership, every instinct screamed that we were in the grip of something far beyond our control. Then came the moment that nearly broke us. One late afternoon, as we navigated a narrow passage between towering rock formations, the ground beneath us began to tremble. A low, rumbling sound grew louder by the second. I halted the group and peered into the distance, my heart pounding in my ears. Emerging from the swirling dust was a vision that defied logic. A haggard, shifting figure with eyes that glowed like burning coals. It was the Skinwalker, back to reclaim its territory and to exact its grim revenge. In that split second, the air grew unbearably cold, and a silence fell over the canyon that was more terrifying than any noise. The creature moved with predatory precision, its form distorting as it advanced. Panic erupted among us. Brand's voice, usually so full of humor, was strangled by terror. Carmen's soft murmurs turned to desperate cries as she clutched her notebook like a lifeline. I stepped forward, the weight of command heavy upon me, and shouted, "Run!" We scattered into the labyrinth of canyons, each of us trying desperately to outrun the nightmare. I led the way, navigating narrow paths and steep drops, my mind a whirlwind of calculated maneuvers and raw, instinctive fear. The creature's pursuit was relentless, its unearthly speed and agility a stark contrast to our faltering steps. I could hear its guttural howls echoing off the canyon walls, each sound a harbinger of impending doom. For what seemed like hours, we ran, through narrow crevices, over rocky ledges, and into the sparse cover of thickets. The creature was always there, lurking just at the periphery of our vision, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. In one desperate moment, I glanced back and saw it closing in on Bran. With a surge of adrenaline, I doubled back, shouting his name. I found him cornered against a crumbling outcrop, his camera discarded as he fought a losing battle against the relentless force. I reached him in time, pulling him to safety just as the creature's claws grazed his shoulder. The pain was searing, and his scream will haunt me forever, a reminder of the fragility of our mortal coil. That night, we managed to find temporary shelter in a narrow ravine, our breaths ragged and our bodies bruised. The enormity of our plight settled over us like a shroud. In the flickering light of a small fire, Carmen tended to Brand's wound while I tried to make sense of the chaos. The Skinwalker's violent presence was undeniable now. It was not merely a ghost or an eerie presence that hung around. It was a lethal force, driven by ancient curses and fueled by our own fear. Death had already claimed one of us, and the creature's eyes promised that more were at risk if we did not act swiftly. In the cold, tense silence that followed, I resolved that we would not allow the entity to break our spirit. Drawing on every lesson learned from my military past, I devised a plan. We would use the terrain to our advantage, setting traps and using Carmen's deep knowledge of the indigenous symbols as a guide. If the creature was bound by ancient rituals, perhaps those very symbols could serve as a shield, even if only for a short time. David's loss was a bitter price, but it spurred me on. I refused to let our journey end in darkness. Over the next day, we gathered stones, sharpened branches, and constructed rudimentary barriers along the narrow paths we would have to traverse. Carmen inscribed protective symbols on scraps of cloth and scattered them along our route, her voice trembling as she recited the old words. Bran's camera, though he had nearly lost it in our flight, became our silent witness, a testament to our struggle and a potential piece of evidence for the unspeakable horror we had encountered. As dusk approached once more, we prepared to make our final push out of the canyon. Every sense was on high alert. The mist, ever our silent companion, began to thicken, obscuring our vision and heightening our anxiety. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon us, the creature lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, in the eerie twilight, it happened again. The skinwalker emerged from the swirling fog, a hideous, contorted figure that defied all rational explanation. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant I felt a cold, paralyzing fear. Yet I stood firm. With a deep, steadying breath, I shouted, "Now!" and signaled for Carmen and Bran to trigger our makeshift traps. The night exploded into chaos as the creature charged. It stumbled into a tangle of sharpened branches and heavy stones, and for a moment I thought we might succeed. But the skinwalker's resilience was unnerving. It shook off the impact and roared in fury. The sound was otherworldly, a blend of human anguish and animalistic rage that sent tremors through the very earth. In the ensuing melee, I fought with every ounce of strength and determination, each move a desperate attempt to protect the lives of those who had come to trust me. The battle raged until the first rays of dawn broke over Black Mesa, casting long, ghostly shadows on the canyon floor. The skinwalker, bloodied and battered, finally receded into the swirling mists, leaving us bruised, terrified, and forever changed. In the quiet aftermath, as we huddled together and tended to our wounds, a somber realization settled over us. The supernatural force we had encountered was not simply a lingering spirit. It was an active, malevolent force that cared little for our survival. Even as we continued our journey out of Black Mesa, every step was haunted by the memory of that night. The loss of David, the terror in Bran's eyes, and the desperate prayers of Carmen were etched into my soul. I knew that the creature could return at any moment, that the curse of Black Mesa was far from broken, but in that shared struggle for survival, we forged a bond, a fragile hope that even in the heart of darkness, human resilience could shine through. Now, months later, I still wake in the dead of night, haunted by the phantom gaze of that cursed entity. The scars of our ordeal remain, both visible and hidden within the depths of our minds. I document our journey not only as a record of horror, but as a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who dare to confront the unknown. Black Mesa taught me that some legends are born of truth, and that in the face of relentless terror, it is our humanity, our ability to love, to fight, and to hope that ultimately defines us. My name is Alice Monroe. I'm 38 years old, and I will never forget the white mist over Black Mesa. That fateful expedition, marked by loss and fear, also revealed an inner strength I never knew I possessed. I learned that survival in the wild is not just about battling nature's physical challenges, but also about confronting the deep, primal fears that lie within. And though the darkness of that cursed land still lingers in my memories, I choose to carry on, knowing that even in the bleakest moments, the human spirit can endure. In the aftermath, as I piece together our fragmented journey, I find solace in the small victories. A moment of camaraderie around a makeshift fire, a shared look of understanding in the midst of despair, and the unwavering determination to document our truth. The wilderness of Black Mesa, with its ancient curses and haunting mists, remains a reminder that some stories are written in blood and shadow, and that the line between legend and reality is often perilously thin, I close my journal with these words, a promise to those who might one day wander into the heart of darkness. Heed the warnings of the past, respect the land and its secrets, and never underestimate the power of ancient forces. For, in the silence of the wild, where every whisper carries the weight of untold horrors, survival is not just a choice, it is a battle fought on every front, within and without. And so my journey continues, marked by the memory of a night when the white mist brought with it a horror that transcended time and reason, a horror that, even now, will forever echo in the silent corridors of my soul. My name is Ethan Reed. I'm 42, and this happened in Medicine Park, Oklahoma, a place where the quiet beauty of the Wichita Mountains meets the reflective mystery of Lake Thunderbird. I had left behind a life marred by regret, seeking redemption in the solitude of the wilderness. I climbed into my battered RV, an old vehicle that had seen better days, and set off with nothing but faded maps, worn memories, and a deep, aching need to find forgiveness within myself. For years, the weight of past mistakes had haunted me. Every night, I dreamt of those lost chances and missteps that had fractured my soul. Medicine Park, with its eerie tranquility and legends whispered by the wind, promised a kind of salvation, a chance to confront those shadows. My plan was simple: drive along forgotten roads, revisit cherished sights from my youth, and let the landscape guide me to a truth I'd been too afraid to face. The RV rumbled along dusty back roads, its engine sputtering in protest as if it too remembered the passage of time. The interior reeked of old leather and memories, and I couldn't help but feel that every creak and groan echoed the sorrow of days gone by. My route took me past sprawling plains and dense stands of trees until I reached Medicine Park, just as the late afternoon sun began to dip low over the horizon. The light, golden and melancholic, bathed the landscape in an almost otherworldly glow. That first evening, I parked near a quiet clearing on the outskirts of town. The air was strangely still, as if the world had paused in anticipation. I settled in, unpacked what little supplies I had, and lit a small fire near the RV. The flames danced and flickered, casting long shadows that swayed like silent specters. As night fell, an unusual hush descended. A silence so profound that even the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures seemed to have been muted. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd about the old radio in the RV. In the midst of static, soft strains of nostalgic music filtered through, melodies that seemed to come from a time long past. There were also faint, indistinct voices, almost like echoes of conversations from decades ago. I wasn't sure if it was the result of my aging equipment or if something else was at work, but each note stirred something deep inside me, a bittersweet reminder of what I'd lost. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed, sleep eluded me. I kept thinking about the soft music and the phantom voices. It was then that I first heard a gentle whisper. At first, it was nearly imperceptible, a soft murmur carried by the wind. But as the minutes passed, the whisper grew clearer, calling my name in a tender, almost familiar tone. "Ethan," it seemed to say, echoing from somewhere beyond the veil of darkness. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to locate the source. But all I saw was the vast expanse of night and the gentle glow of the RV's interior. I told myself it was just loneliness, the ghost of my own memories. Yet, deep down, I knew there was something more. The following day dawned with the subtle promise of clarity. Determined to unravel the mystery, I decided to explore the surrounding areas. My first destination was a small clearing near the edge of town, a place that had once been a favorite spot during my childhood. I remembered running there, carefree and full of hope before life's burdens forced me to abandon those dreams. Driving slowly down a gravel road, I couldn't help but notice how the world seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of nature were muted, replaced by an almost reverent stillness. Arriving at the clearing, I parked the RV under a towering oak whose limbs stretched like ancient arms. I stepped out and was immediately struck by the scent of damp earth and pine, a fragrance that felt both grounding and strangely melancholic. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. As I wandered slowly, memories began to resurface. A warm summer day spent laughing with old friends, a bittersweet goodbye to a lost love, and the unresolved regrets that had driven me here. It was during one of these quiet moments that I saw it, a soft glow on the horizon, not too far from where I stood. At first, I thought it was the reflection of the setting sun on a distant lake, but the light pulsed gently, like the beat of a heart. Compelled by a force I couldn't resist, I followed it through a narrow path lined with wildflowers and overgrown grasses. The closer I got, the more distinct the figure became. It wasn't until I reached a small copse of trees that I recognized the form, a translucent figure, faint and shimmering, standing under a half-withered birch tree. The figure looked almost human, but there was an undeniable aura of sorrow about it, a sorrow that resonated with the pain I carried inside. For a long moment we simply regarded each other. The apparition's eyes held a gentle sadness, and its lips moved in silent lament. I could not tell if it was a ghost from my own past or a manifestation of my inner guilt, but in that instant, I felt an overwhelming urge to listen. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure did not answer with words, but the air around me seemed to fill with the soft strains of that familiar, nostalgic melody from the radio the night before. Over the next several days, this spectral presence began to appear intermittently. Sometimes it would be there at the edge of my vision as I drove along lonely roads, and other times I'd catch a glimpse of it in the reflective surface of a quiet lake. Each encounter left me with more questions than answers. I started to notice other signs too. An old, weathered photograph tucked beneath the windshield wiper, a fragment of a diary page lodged in the RV's seat, and even symbols etched faintly into rocks along the roadside. They all seemed to hint at a past intertwined with pain, regret, and perhaps the hope of forgiveness. As I drove back and forth between these locations, piecing together the clues, I began to understand that the supernatural manifestations were not here to harm me. Instead, they were gentle guides, urging me to confront the memories I had long suppressed. At times, the figure would seem to lead me to a place that held particular significance: a derelict chapel on the edge of a quiet forest, a forgotten playground where I had once laughed, or a small cemetery with weathered headstones. Each location stirred up emotions I had carefully buried, forcing me to relive moments of loss and remorse. One particularly foggy evening, after a long day of traveling and introspection, my RV broke down in a remote stretch of road. The engine coughed and sputtered until it died completely, leaving me stranded in the twilight. I spent hours trying to coax it back to life, but the stubborn old machine refused to budge. With no cell service and only the dim glow of dusk, I was forced to leave the RV temporarily and seek shelter in an old, abandoned service station that stood silently by the roadside. Inside, the building was cold and drafty. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through cracked windows. I set up a small makeshift bed on a worn bench and tried to gather my thoughts. That night, as I sat huddled against the chill, the gentle whisper returned. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of soft footsteps in the corridor beyond the service station. I followed the sound cautiously, my heart pounding with both dread and anticipation. In a small unused office, I discovered a wall covered in old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. They detailed stories of lost love, tragedy, and redemption, accounts from people who had once found solace in Medicine Park. It was as if the very building was steeped in the same melancholy I felt inside. I spent the night poring over the clippings by the light of a flickering candle, feeling an odd kinship with these strangers who had also sought to mend broken lives. Their words resonated with me, each sentence a reminder that even in despair, there could be hope. As the candle burned low, I felt a soft presence near me, a hand, cool and comforting, brushing against my shoulder. I looked up, but the room was empty save for the dancing shadows on the walls. The sensation left me both unnerved and inexplicably comforted, as if I was being reassured that I wasn't alone on this journey of redemption. With the first light of dawn, I managed to get the RV running again. Thanks to a burst of stubborn determination and a touch of luck, I resumed my journey, though my heart remained heavy with the lingering memories of that night. The supernatural signs continued to guide me, each encounter pushing me to face the unresolved chapters of my past. I started keeping a journal in the RV, documenting every subtle hint and cryptic message. I wrote down the coordinates of each significant location, the words that seemed to emanate from the ghostly figure, and the feelings that surged within me each time the past came knocking. One day, while traveling along a winding road flanked by ancient oak trees, I noticed something carved into a particularly large, gnarled trunk. The inscription was faint, nearly erased by time, but I could make out a single word: forgive. My breath caught in my throat. I sat there for a long moment, letting the weight of that simple command sink into my soul. It was as if the land itself was urging me to let go of the burdens I carried. In the following days, the guidance became more pointed. The spectral figure led me to a secluded grove that contained a small, dilapidated chapel. The chapel, hidden away among towering pines and shrouded in an ethereal mist, seemed to pulse with the energy of long-forgotten prayers. Inside, the pews were worn and the altar covered in dust, but there was a serene quality to the space that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside me. Here, I found a faded photograph tucked behind a loose stone in the wall, a picture of a smiling family, the warmth of their faces a stark reminder of what I had lost, and perhaps what I could still reclaim. I spent hours in that chapel, speaking softly to the apparition I sensed lingering in the corners. I told it of my failures, my regrets, and my desperate hope for forgiveness. I recounted memories of a time when life had been simpler and full of promise, when every sunrise held the promise of a new beginning. As I spoke, I felt an inexplicable lightness begin to seep into my heart, a small, tentative healing taking root. That night, back in my RV parked in a clearing near the chapel, the ghostly presence made its final appearance. I was awoken by the soft strains of that familiar nostalgic melody and the gentle whisper calling my name. I stepped outside into the cool night air and found the figure standing by an old oak, its form bathed in moonlight. There was a profound stillness in the air, as if time itself had paused to witness this moment of reckoning. The figure extended a hand, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt an overwhelming surge of compassion and understanding. In that silent communion, I knew what I had to do. I retrieved a small worn box from the RV, a keepsake from a painful chapter of my past. With trembling hands, I opened it and took out a faded locket containing a photograph of someone I had once loved dearly, but had lost through my own mistakes. Tears streamed down my face as I held the locket, and with a deep, shuddering breath I placed it into a small crevice in the rocky ground near the oak tree. In that moment, I whispered a promise of forgiveness, to them, to myself, and to the land that had witnessed so much sorrow. The act felt cathartic, a symbolic burial of the past that had haunted me for so long. The ghostly figure seemed to nod in silent approval before slowly dissolving into the night, leaving behind only the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the wind. I stood there for what felt like hours, the weight on my heart gradually lifting as I watched the locket become one with the earth. Over the following days, the supernatural occurrences dwindled. The soft music on the radio faded to silence, and the whispers ceased to call my name. Yet, I felt a deep sense of peace settling over me, a quiet assurance that I had finally begun to mend the fractured parts of my soul. I resumed my journey through Medicine Park, now not as a man fleeing his past, but as one slowly embracing the promise of a future unburdened by regret. Driving along the winding roads with a renewed sense of purpose, I found that the landscape had subtly transformed as well. The oppressive silence was replaced by a gentle, comforting hum, a murmur of nature and hope intertwined. I passed by familiar sights that once evoked only sorrow, and now they seemed imbued with a tender beauty, a reminder that even the most scarred earth could blossom anew with care and understanding. As I finally neared the outskirts of Medicine Park, the RV's engine purred steadily beneath me, and I realized that my journey was far from over. I had found a measure of redemption in the silent guidance of a sorrowful spirit, in the carved word, "forgive," on an ancient oak, and in the act of letting go of a past that had long weighed me down. I knew that the path ahead would still hold challenges, both practical and emotional, but I now carried with me a quiet strength, a resilience born of hardship and the gentle touch of supernatural grace. Looking back on that time, I understand that Medicine Park wasn't just a physical destination. It was a crucible where my inner demons were confronted and slowly, painfully released. The ghostly presence, the strange clues, and the echoes of the past were all part of a larger tapestry, one woven with threads of sorrow, memory, and ultimately hope. I emerged from that wilderness not unscathed, but transformed. A man who had learned that true redemption is not found by erasing the past, but by embracing it, forgiving it, and allowing it to guide you toward a future filled with possibility. Now, as I continue down the open road, I carry with me the quiet reassurance of that journey. The lessons of Medicine Park echo in every mile I drive, in every whisper of the wind through the trees. I know that even when life's shadows fall across my path, there is always a glimmer of light, a reminder that every ending holds the promise of a new beginning. And so, I move forward, not as a man defined by his mistakes, but as one who has learned to let go, to forgive, and to trust that the gentle guidance of the past can lead to a brighter, more compassionate future. My journey of redemption continues, each day a step further away from the darkness and closer to the healing light of understanding. My name is Dylan Price, and I'm 40 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 when I set out on an RV camping trip in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, desperate for solitude and a chance to heal old wounds. I was a former teacher, burdened by a grief I'd never fully overcome, a grief tied to a tragedy that had haunted me for years. I hoped that the isolation of the forest would offer a space to reconcile with my past and find a semblance of redemption. I'd spent weeks preparing for this journey, meticulously planning my route to a remote area near an abandoned playground that local lore claimed was steeped in sorrow and mystery. I wasn't entirely sure why I felt so inexplicably drawn to that forgotten site, but something inside me whispered that the ghosts of that place might mirror the ghosts of my own past. My RV, an old but trusty vehicle, had been my companion through many solitary trips. On this journey, however, it seemed to mirror my inner state. The engine sputtered intermittently, and the electrical system, responsible for the RV's flickering interior lights and unreliable heater, had been acting up for weeks. I had convinced myself that a little inconvenience was a small price to pay for the peace I sought. As I left the outskirts of town and ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that every creak of the RV and every flicker of its light was a prelude to something more ominous. The drive was long and quiet, with the dense forest and winding trails serving as both a physical and metaphorical barrier between me and the past I wanted to escape. My only companions were the radio's sporadic static and the soft murmur of the wind outside. By late afternoon, the towering trees and rugged landscape of Broken Bow enveloped me in their ancient silence. I parked the RV in a small clearing, just far enough from any signs of civilization to feel like I was truly alone. That first night, as darkness claimed the forest, I set up a modest camp outside the RV. I lit a small fire, more for comfort than for cooking, and sat watching the flames dance against the backdrop of the looming trees. It was then that I first heard it. An indistinct giggling, almost too soft to catch. I tried to convince myself that it was the wind playing tricks with the branches, but the sound held a tone of childish mirth that was impossible to ignore. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay on the cool ground outside the RV, staring up at the star-filled sky, listening to the soft, intermittent laughter. It ebbed and flowed like a distant lullaby, a sound that both soothed and unsettled me. Every so often I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a fleeting shape of a small figure darting between the trees, vanishing before my eyes could focus on it. The air itself seemed to thicken, and an inexplicable chill settled over me, as if unseen eyes were watching my every move. In the morning, I set out on foot to explore the area, determined to discover the source of the eerie sounds. The RV remained behind, its interior lit by weak, flickering bulbs that added an air of desperation to my temporary shelter. As I walked, I noted that the temperature had dropped noticeably around the campsite, and my breath came out in visible puffs even in the warmth of the late autumn sun. The forest was unnervingly still, the usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves muted as though nature itself was holding its breath. I wandered until I came upon a narrow, overgrown path that led me deeper into the woods. The further I ventured, the more I noticed odd details. A swing set, its chains creaking in the wind, gently swaying as if moved by invisible hands. Faded murals on crumbling walls that hinted at happier times now consumed by neglect, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment that clung to the ruins like a shroud. My heart pounded as I realized that I had found the abandoned playground that local legends spoke of, a relic of a community tragedy that had been quietly buried by time. The playground was hauntingly beautiful and tragic in equal measure. Rusted metal and broken plastic swings formed a skeletal reminder of laughter and joy, now silenced forever. I walked slowly among the structures, feeling as if I were treading on sacred ground. In a far corner, beneath a sagging, vine-covered arch, I discovered remnants of personal mementos, a faded photograph of smiling children, an old diary with water-damaged pages, and small trinkets that seemed to have been left behind in a hurry. It was as if the playground itself was a shrine to the memories of those lost souls, inviting me to remember and to mourn. Standing there, I began to hear the voices more clearly. They were no longer the distant, indistinct giggles of the night, but soft, desperate whispers, almost pleading in their sorrow. The voices echoed around me, and for a moment I felt as if I were no longer alone. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, and in that moment, I remembered the tragic event that had forever altered my life, a day I had tried so hard to forget. I had been a teacher, responsible for the care of children who looked to me for protection, and I had failed. The memory of that failure, of a child I couldn't save, had haunted me ever since. The emotional weight of that memory was overwhelming, and the spectral voices seemed to resonate with my inner guilt. I sank to the ground, tears streaming down my face, as I realized that the lost souls here might be reflecting my own sense of loss. I felt an inexplicable kinship with them, a bond forged from shared sorrow and unhealed wounds. Determined to find some measure of redemption for both myself and these restless spirits, I returned to my RV. The mechanical failures of the vehicle, which had troubled me earlier, now seemed like an additional layer of misfortune, an echo of my inner disrepair. The heater sputtered and died just as I settled into a worn-out armchair, leaving me in a cold, dimly lit interior. I tried to distract myself with the radio, but static filled every channel as if even the airwaves were mourning. That night, I resolved to perform a ritual of closure. A blend of indigenous customs I had read about and my own desperate need for forgiveness. I gathered the remnants I had found at the playground, the faded photograph, the diary, and the small trinkets, and I returned to the playground under a slate-gray sky. The air was thick with anticipation, and the haunting lullabies of invisible children filled the space around me. I arranged the items in a small circle on the ground, right in the center of the playground, and sat cross-legged before them. I began to speak softly, words of apology and sorrow spilling from my lips, as if I were addressing both the lost souls and the child I had failed to save. The words felt ancient and unfamiliar, borrowed from the whispers of folklore that Mia, a friend who had once tried to help me understand such matters, had once mentioned. I don't know if I was reciting them correctly, but it didn't matter. In that moment, I poured out every ounce of regret and grief that had accumulated over the years, hoping that these words might somehow bridge the gap between my broken heart and the silent anguish of the playground. As I continued, the wind picked up, and the swing set began to move more vigorously, as if stirred by an unseen force. The spectral voices grew louder, their tones shifting from mournful to almost forgiving. I could feel a warmth spreading through me, a gentle reassurance that perhaps, after all these years, some form of healing was possible. The ritual, so raw and vulnerable, seemed to create a fragile connection between the living and the dead, a shared space where pain could be acknowledged and slowly released. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind subsided, and the playground fell into a profound, almost sacred silence. The spectral children, their forms dim and indistinct, began to fade away, their whispers softening into a quiet sigh that seemed to carry a promise of rest. I sat there for a long time, letting the stillness wrap around me like a comforting blanket. In that silence, I sensed that both I and the spirits had taken a step toward forgiveness, toward finding peace with the past. But even as I felt that cathartic shift, a lingering unease remained, a reminder that not all of our demons are so easily exorcised. My RV, now a battered sanctuary, awaited my return, and I knew that I had to confront the reality of leaving the haunted playground behind. The journey back felt different. The forest no longer seemed entirely oppressive, but there was still an air of melancholy that clung to every rustling leaf and creaking branch. Back at the RV, I found that the mechanical issues had worsened overnight. The heater refused to ignite, and the flickering lights were more erratic than before, plunging the interior into intermittent darkness. In that dim light, I scribbled notes in my journal, capturing the raw emotion of the night's events and the uncertain hope that had begun to emerge. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew that this experience had changed me irrevocably. Over the next few days, I made slow progress repairing the RV and slowly reconnecting with the world outside the forest. I drove cautiously along winding back roads, the memory of the playground and its ghostly inhabitants always lingering at the edges of my consciousness. I found myself replaying that night over and over, a night of grief, of confrontation with my deepest failures, and of a fragile, tentative hope for redemption. I eventually returned to Broken Bow for one final visit, not as a haunted soul seeking absolution, but as a man determined to honor the past while embracing a future free of overwhelming guilt. I visited the abandoned playground one last time, leaving behind a small bouquet of wildflowers and lighting a candle in memory of the lost children. The wind whispered through the trees as I stood there, and for a moment I felt that the spirits acknowledged my gesture. In that silent communion, I sensed that we had both begun the process of healing. Now, as I write these words in a modest notebook back in the safety of my rebuilt RV, I know that the journey I undertook in Broken Bow was not merely an escape from a troubled past. It was a confrontation with it. I learned that redemption isn't a destination reached by avoiding pain or running from memories. It is found in facing them head-on, in accepting that the scars we carry are as much a part of us as the hope that drives us forward. I still hear the faint echoes of children's laughter and whispered apologies when the wind is right. Reminders that the past is never truly gone. But I also know that with every step I take away from that haunted playground, I am reclaiming a part of myself that had long been lost to regret. My name is Dylan Price, and I carry the memory of Broken Bow with me. A bittersweet reminder that even in the midst of sorrow and isolation, there is a path to healing, if only we dare to walk it. My name is Alex Reed. I'm 37 years old, and this is the account of the most harrowing weekend of my life. One that unfolded deep within the dark, unyielding woods of Tishomingo State Park in Oklahoma. I was once a park ranger, trained to respect the wilderness and its secrets, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to face. It all began when I, along with my close friends Brooke Carter, C.J. James, and Dana Lewis, decided to embark on an RV camping trip. We needed a break from the grind of daily life. Brooke, ever the sensitive soul, craved an escape into nature's calm embrace. CJ, the daredevil among us, was hungry for adventure and a rush of adrenaline. And Dana, our steadfast skeptic, was determined to debunk every local myth and superstition. I volunteered to lead the group, confident that my background as a park ranger would keep us safe. We piled into our aging RV one bright Friday morning. The vehicle, already showing signs of wear, groaned under the weight of our equipment. Our plans were ambitious. A weekend of camping, hiking, and maybe even a few survival drills, as I insisted on testing our skills in the backwoods of Tishomingo. The excitement was palpable, but so was an undercurrent of tension. CJ's wild enthusiasm often clashed with Dana's rationality, and Brooke's emotional intuitions added another layer of unpredictability. I tried my best to keep the mood light, reassuring everyone that the natural world was forgiving if one only respected it. Yet, as fate would have it, our journey was marred from the very start. Shortly after leaving the main highway, our GPS began to malfunction, flickering between directions as if indecisive. The RV's portable generator sputtered and then failed altogether, leaving us with a battery that barely clung to life. "This old beast is going to be the least of our worries," Dana remarked dryly, her tone laced with skepticism. I couldn't help but feel a prickling sense of foreboding, as if the universe itself were warning us that our path was not one of ease. That first night, as dusk fell, we found a clearing just off a rugged trail where we decided to set up camp. The sky was a deep, unsettling blue, and a dense fog began to roll in, shrouding the forest in a ghostly haze. I remember the silence, an oppressive quiet that swallowed the usual chorus of nocturnal wildlife. It was Brooke who first noticed the markings. "Alex, come look at these," she whispered, pointing to a series of crude symbols etched into the bark of an ancient oak. They looked like indigenous glyphs, raw and unsettling, as if carved in haste by hands long lost to time. I felt a chill run down my spine. Local lore told of curses and vengeful spirits tied to such markings, but I dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of the fog and our tired eyes. However, the eerie feeling only deepened as the night progressed. The RV's battery inexplicably died, plunging us into near-total darkness despite our attempts to light a fire. We huddled together inside, the feeble glow of our flashlights casting long, jittering shadows on the walls. Outside, every sound was amplified, the creaking of trees, the rustling of leaves, and somewhere in the distance, I distinctly heard what sounded like low, guttural whispers. "Is anyone else hearing that?" CJ asked, his voice half in awe, half in fear. Dana simply scoffed, attributing the sounds to the wind. But Brooke's eyes filled with tears as she murmured, "It's like the forest is crying out, warning us." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, after a restless sleep filled with half-remembered nightmares, we emerged to find the forest transformed. The air was heavy with a metallic scent, and the birdsong had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. Near our campsite, we discovered large, unidentifiable footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were too big and oddly shaped, as if not belonging to any animal we knew. I documented the prints, my mind racing through possibilities, none of which provided any comfort. As we began to prepare for a day of hiking to scout the area, tensions flared. Dana's insistence on rational explanations clashed with CJ's wild theories of supernatural entities stalking us, while Brooke's quiet dread grew with every step deeper into the forest. I tried to focus on the practical, securing our equipment, marking our path, but even I couldn't ignore the palpable sense of dread that clung to us like a second skin. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon another chilling sign. Along a narrow, winding trail, we came upon a clearing where the fog had given way to a bizarre, almost otherworldly spectacle. In the center, standing motionless, was a woman in a tattered white dress. Her eyes, though empty, seemed to pierce right through me. I stopped in my tracks, unsure whether to approach or flee. Brooke gasped. "That's the spirit, the one from the legend." The local lore that had once seemed like distant myth was suddenly all too real. A ghost of a woman doomed to wander these woods. Her presence a harbinger of ancient sorrow and forgotten curses. Dana rolled her eyes and muttered, "It's probably just a drifter or someone playing a prank." But even her words couldn't mask the tremor of fear that ran through her voice. We watched, frozen, as the figure slowly drifted away, disappearing into the mist like a wisp of smoke. It was the last straw. The forest had revealed its dark secrets, and there was no turning back. The day passed in a haze of uncertainty and whispered conversations. CJ, ever the impulsive one, wanted to press further into the forest, convinced that the thrill of uncovering more mysteries outweighed any danger. Dana argued for retreat, her logical mind demanding concrete evidence before risking further peril. Brooke, her intuition overwhelmed, could only plead for caution. I found myself torn between the need to uncover the truth and the instinct to protect those I cared about. That evening, as we sat around a small makeshift fire outside the RV, the temperature plummeted, and the shadows grew longer. A sudden, violent gust of wind extinguished our flames, plunging us back into darkness. Then came the whispers again, a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath our feet. I felt a presence circling us, an unseen force that pressed against the barriers of our fragile sanctuary. The symbols on the trees began to glow faintly in the moonlight, their meaning inscrutable but undeniably ominous. In the chaos, our equipment continued to fail. The RV's battery, which had already abandoned us, was now completely dead, and our attempts to re-establish any sort of communication with the outside world were futile. It felt as if the forest itself was cutting us off, isolating us from any hope of rescue. It wasn't long before the threat manifested in a terrifying physical form. As we huddled inside the dark confines of the RV, a series of frantic knocks rattled the door. The sound was irregular, almost desperate, and it sent chills through me. "Stay here," I ordered, though even I wasn't sure what I was about to face. I unlatched the door slowly, flashlight in hand, revealing a figure cloaked in the heavy mist. Before me stood a grotesque vision, a creature that defied easy explanation. Its form was ambiguous, shifting between human and something far more animalistic. The eyes, glowing with an unearthly light, held an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. In that moment, I recalled the legends of the Skinwalker, a shape-shifter cursed to roam the land, a harbinger of doom for those who dared disturb the sacred grounds. But as I stared, it became clear that this was no simple myth. The creature's presence exuded a raw, unfiltered danger, and its intentions were unmistakably violent. I shouted a warning to my friends inside the RV, and the ensuing moments were a blur of chaos. CJ, driven by adrenaline, flung open the door and lunged at the creature, only to be thrown back by an unseen force. Brooke's scream pierced the night as she clutched her arms, her eyes wide with terror, while Dana's rational facade crumbled as she scrambled for anything to defend herself. I fought to regain control of the situation, desperately trying to usher everyone back into the safety of the RV. The creature attacked again, its movements erratic yet calculated. In the ensuing struggle, I managed to throw a heavy tool at it, a rusted iron bar salvaged from our broken equipment. The impact drove it back momentarily, but the reprieve was short-lived. With a guttural snarl, it circled our RV, its eyes never leaving us, as if studying our every move. Inside the RV, panic had taken hold. Dana's skepticism had been replaced by raw terror, and Brooke's tear-streaked face bore the mark of a deep inner fear. CJ, bruised and shaken, muttered about curses and ancient debts. I knew that I had to regain control if we were to survive. "We need to hold our ground," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're not going to let it take us without a fight." Drawing on my ranger training, I began to improvise defenses. I managed to light a series of torches using some spare equipment, positioning them near the doors and windows. The flickering light cast wild shadows on the walls, and for a brief moment the creature recoiled from the intensity. It was then that Brooke, her voice trembling yet determined, recalled an old ritual she'd read about in local folklore, a counterspell meant to ward off malevolent spirits. "I think we need to recite this incantation," she said, her hands shaking as she fumbled with a crumpled piece of paper containing the ancient symbols and words. Dinah, though still fearful, helped Brooke position the makeshift talismans we had found carved into the trees near our campsite. As we chanted in unison, the wind seemed to shift, carrying our words into the night. The creature paused, as if caught between the pull of two worlds, and for one agonizing moment, silence reigned. Then, with a hideous roar that shattered the fragile calm, the entity surged forward, its entire being radiating pure malice. I leapt into action, positioning myself between the creature and my friends. The struggle was fierce and chaotic, each moment an endless battle for survival. I swung the iron bar repeatedly, each blow landing with a resounding thud that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. The creature retaliated with savage, unpredictable strikes, leaving deep gashes along the side of the RV and on my arms. Amid the fray, I could sense that we were fighting not just for our lives, but for our very souls. The creature wasn't merely a ghost or a myth. It was a living manifestation of an ancient curse, an embodiment of all the anger, sorrow, and malice the forest had accumulated over centuries. In one desperate moment, I managed to drive it back with a well-timed strike, and it retreated into the shadows, leaving us gasping and battered. The night passed in a tense, breathless vigil. We did not dare leave the RV, and every creak and whisper in the dark set our nerves on edge. The encounter had left us physically bruised and emotionally shattered. Dawn broke slowly, revealing a forest that looked no less serene than before. Yet it now harbored a secret terror behind every rustle of leaves and every shaft of light. As the morning light filtered through the trees, we inspected our injuries and tried to assess the damage. CJ was limping noticeably, and Dana's face was etched with lines of disbelief and regret. Brooke sat quietly in a corner, clutching the crumpled talisman as if it were a lifeline. I knew that we had been changed by the night's events. The once-believed boundaries between myth and reality had crumbled, replaced by a stark, terrifying truth. We spent the day fortifying our makeshift camp and repairing what we could of the RV, but a palpable tension remained. It was as if the forest itself had turned against us, a sentient force, watching and waiting. The symbols on the trees glowed faintly in the afternoon light, a constant reminder of the ancient curse that had been awoken. We discussed our next move in hushed, anxious tones. Dana, now fully relinquishing her earlier rational detachment, urged that we leave immediately, convinced that the spirit of vengeance would not be easily placated. CJ, ever the adventurer, argued that we should press on to uncover more of the truth, to understand the curse, and perhaps even find a way to break it. Brooke, torn between fear and a deep intuitive need to honor the traditions of the land, pleaded for caution and respect for the old ways. I felt the weight of leadership heavy on my shoulders. My ranger training told me that the land was not to be defied, that it held power far beyond the comprehension of modern man. I decided that we would retreat for the night, gathering our strength to make a measured decision in the morning. As night fell, once again, the forest grew darker and the oppressive silence returned. The supernatural threat, though unseen, loomed in every shadow. In the early hours before dawn, a tense calm settled over our camp. We had barely slept, each of us haunted by memories of the night's violent encounter. It was then that the true test of our resolve arrived. The RV's door burst open, and a series of frantic knocks reverberated through the small space. This time it wasn't just the creature, it was something else entirely. Steeling myself, I swung open the door and found, to my horror, that the ground outside was littered with remnants of crude, hand-carved totems. The symbols were more elaborate than those we had seen before, arranged in a circle around our RV as if marking it as a site of sacrilege. In the center of this circle, I saw the unmistakable figure of a cannibalistic indigenous cult, a group rumored in local legends to have been cursed, their rituals twisted by ancient, malevolent spirits. Their faces were obscured by hoods, and their eyes burned with fanatic zeal. One of them stepped forward, brandishing a long, jagged blade. A moment of paralyzing terror held me as the figure chanted in a language I couldn't decipher. The air grew thick with the scent of burning sage and something far more acrid, a stench of decay and blood. In that instant, the supernatural forces that had tormented us all week converged. The spectral skinwalker from the night before, the ghostly apparitions, and now these human zealots all merged into one chaotic tableau of horror. I shouted for everyone to retreat into the RV, my voice echoing in the silent forest. Dana scrambled for any available weapon while CJ moved to block the entrance, his daredevil spirit now tempered by genuine terror. Brooke, trembling, recited the incantation once more, her words a desperate prayer against the rising tide of darkness. The cultists advanced slowly, their chants reaching a fevered pitch, and the creature from our previous encounter reappeared behind them, its form now more monstrous, more vengeful than ever. In the ensuing melee, I found myself locked in a desperate struggle, not just for my own life, but for the survival of my friends. The creature lunged, its claws raking across the RV's metal exterior, and I countered with every ounce of strength, swinging my iron bar with precision born of years in the wild. The chaos was nearly overwhelming. Shouts, clashing metal, and the relentless, otherworldly wails of the entity filled the air. For what felt like an eternity, I battled on, driven by a primal urge to protect those I loved and to put an end to the nightmare that had been unleashed upon us. I managed to knock one of the cultists to the ground, his blade clattering uselessly away. Donna, summoning a courage that belied her earlier skepticism, used a broken branch as a makeshift club to fend off another attacker. CJ, though injured, fought with a wild abandon that was both reckless and heroic. And Brooke, she kept chanting, her voice growing stronger with every word, as if her fervor was igniting a shield around us. Then, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, something miraculous occurred. The creature, sensing the impending arrival of daylight, and perhaps the waning strength of its dark magic, receded into the depths of the forest. The cultists, their chants faltering in the face of the coming day, scattered into the underbrush, leaving behind only the eerie silence of a battle fought at the edge of two worlds. In the quiet aftermath, we gathered our bearings amidst the wreckage of our camp. The scars we bore were not just physical, they were etched deep into our souls. CJ was barely coherent, and Dana's once sharp mind was dulled by the shock of what we had witnessed. Brooke sat in a daze, clutching the talisman as if it were a lifeline to a world now irreversibly changed. I looked around at my friends, the weight of our shared ordeal settling heavily upon us. I knew then that the forest had not released us entirely. Tishomingo State Park was steeped in ancient curses and dark rituals, a place where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was perilously thin. The forces we had encountered, be they the shifting visage of a skinwalker, the mournful ghost of a woman in white, or the fanatic cultists guided by blood-soaked legends, had not been content to simply haunt us. They had come with a violent, unyielding intent to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. In the days that followed, we made our way back to civilization, our RV a battered relic of a battle waged in the shadows. We avoided speaking much of that night, each of us silently processing the terror and the inexplicable loss of innocence. I documented every detail in a journal, a desperate attempt to rationalize the irrational and to capture the fleeting moments of horror that had forever altered our lives. Even now, as I write this, the memory of that fateful weekend remains vivid. The forest is quiet during the day, but I can still hear the echoes of chanting and feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. I know that somewhere in the depths of Tishomingo State Park, the ancient curse lingers, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to trespass into its domain. I've learned that some places are best left undisturbed, that the natural world holds secrets that defy modern understanding, and that survival sometimes means accepting that some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Alex Reed, and I survived that night by clinging to hope and the bonds of friendship. But the shadows of Tishomingo remain with me, a constant reminder that the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and that sometimes the darkest forces are the ones we never truly see coming. I hope that by sharing this account, others might be forewarned. Nature is beautiful, yes, but it can also be ruthless. When you venture into the wild, you do so at your own risk, and sometimes the price is more than you ever imagined. As for me, I still carry the scars of that night, both visible and hidden, and every so often when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear the faint, desperate echoes of that ancient chant. A reminder that some forces are never truly vanquished, only lying in wait for the next unwary traveler. The ordeal changed me, made me more cautious, more respectful of the mysteries of the land. I no longer scoff at legends or dismiss the eerie as mere coincidence. In the deep, dark woods of Tishomingo, the old ways still hold power, and the line between the living and the supernatural is drawn in shadows and whispered curses. I carry that truth with me always, a heavy burden of knowledge and a silent promise to honor the wild as it truly is, a realm of beauty and terror, where every step into the unknown might awaken the echoes of a long-forgotten curse. This is my story, and it is one I will never forget. The wilderness taught me that survival is not merely a matter of physical strength, but of understanding and respecting forces beyond our control. And while I continue my journey through life, the specter of that cursed night in Tishomingo State Park remains, a dark, lingering reminder of the fine line between legend and reality. My name is Mike Carter. I'm 45 years old, and this is the story of a journey that forced me to confront the ghosts of my past, both literal and metaphorical, in the depths of the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. This happened one autumn when I left behind a life full of regret, estrangement, and unresolved pain, hoping that the solitude of the forest and the isolation of my old RV would help me find a path to redemption. I left my city apartment on a chilly Friday morning, my battered RV loaded with nothing more than essential belongings, a few mementos of a better time, and a heart weighed down by years of regret. The road stretched out ahead of me like an unwritten promise, a chance to atone for past mistakes and rebuild a life that had long been in ruins. I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeking. Perhaps it was forgiveness, perhaps a way to silence the relentless voices of self-blame. All I knew was that I needed to escape. The RV, an aging relic that had seen better days, sputtered as I pulled onto the highway. Its engine coughed and wheezed, and I couldn't help but draw a parallel between its condition and my own battered soul. Every flicker of the dashboard light and every creak of the frame reminded me that I was venturing into territory where neither man nor machine was guaranteed to perform as expected. I pressed on, driving deeper into the wild, letting the hum of the engine drown out the memories that so often haunted me. Not long after entering the forest's fringes, my RV began to show signs of failing. The electrical system stuttered, and the lights inside the vehicle flickered unpredictably. I pulled over by the roadside to inspect the damage, feeling an unsettling sense of vulnerability. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring with fate to force me to slow down, to face what lay ahead rather than rush blindly forward. I managed a temporary fix, but the lingering worry that my escape might be interrupted never left me. That first night in a clearing near a meandering dirt road, I set up camp under a canopy of ancient trees. The silence was profound, a silence so deep it almost seemed to swallow every thought. As darkness fell, the forest took on a different personality. Shadows shifted in ways that made me question whether I was truly alone. A sudden gust of wind rattled the RV's thin walls, and for a moment I thought I heard soft murmurs that could have been the wind or something else. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as I crawled into the small, creaky bed of the RV, but sleep eluded me. Every creak and whisper outside sent my mind spiraling back to memories of lost love and broken promises. I remembered my estranged spouse, the words we'd left unsaid, and the child I'd once held so tenderly. In the darkness, the line between memory and hallucination blurred, and I wondered if the forest was somehow tapping into my innermost regrets. The next morning, I awoke to a mist that blanketed the forest in a ghostly haze. As I stepped outside, the chill in the air seemed to seep into my bones. I began my routine of checking the RV and exploring the immediate surroundings, hoping that the fresh daylight would clear the fog of my troubled thoughts. That's when I found it. A faded photograph, partially hidden beneath a cluster of wildflowers just a few feet from my parked vehicle. The photograph was of a family, smiling and united, a stark contrast to the disintegration of my own. On the back, a handwritten note read, "You are not alone in your journey." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Had someone left this for me? It was as if the forest had offered a small, cryptic gesture of empathy, or perhaps a warning. I pocketed the photograph and note, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, guided, or even tested by forces beyond my understanding. Throughout the day, I began to notice other oddities. There were personal mementos scattered near my campsite, an old key, a small locket, even a scrap of paper with words that I couldn't quite make out. These items, relics of past lives, seemed to resonate with my own history of pain and loss. I started to wonder if these were simply remnants left behind by previous wanderers, or if the forest was somehow curating a collection of memories meant to confront me with my own demons. As the dusk approached on my second night, the forest transformed into something out of a dream, or a nightmare. The air grew heavy, and the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were replaced by distant echoes that resembled the voices of loved ones I had lost. I sat by the RV's window, clutching a worn photograph of my daughter, when I saw them, faint, ghostly silhouettes drifting between the trees. They were ephemeral and indistinct, but each time I blinked I felt like I was catching a glimpse of someone I knew, an echo of the past that refused to be forgotten. At first, I rationalized these visions as tricks of the light and the power of suggestion. But as the nights wore on, the apparitions grew more vivid. One evening, in the midst of a sudden downpour, a translucent figure appeared outside my RV. The shape of a person, a woman perhaps, stood silently in the rain. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, met mine for a moment before she faded away like mist. I couldn't help but feel that she embodied every regret and missed chance in my life. An echo of the relationships I had let crumble under the weight of my own failures. The apparitions didn't bring terror in the conventional sense. Rather, they stirred up a deep, unsettling melancholy. Their presence was a constant reminder that the past was inescapable, that my guilt and sorrow were intertwined with the very fabric of the forest. I began to understand that these supernatural manifestations were not malicious. They were manifestations of my own inner turmoil, dredging up the pain I had long tried to suppress. Midway through my journey, the weather took a turn for the worse. A sudden, violent storm swept in, trapping me near my RV as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the metal walls. The RV, already struggling with its aging engine and faltering electrical system, shuddered under the onslaught of nature. Communication devices failed, and I was completely cut off from the outside world. It was just me, the storm, and the oppressive silence punctuated only by the howling wind. Inside the RV, the atmosphere grew stifling and claustrophobic. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was utterly isolated, both physically and emotionally. In that solitude, the ghostly encounters intensified. The whispers outside took on a new urgency, as if urging me to confront the demons that I had been running from for so long. Every flash of lightning revealed fleeting images, faces of people I'd hurt, regrets that I couldn't erase, and memories that clamored for acknowledgement. At the height of the storm, when the wind and rain seemed to merge into a single relentless force, I experienced the most vivid apparition of all. In the flickering light of a makeshift candle, I saw a figure that resembled my estranged spouse, a spectral mirror of my past. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow, disappointment, and an almost pleading intensity. In a voice that seemed to come from both far away and right beside me, she whispered, "Why did you let go? Why didn't you fight for us?" I staggered back, overwhelmed by the raw surge of emotion. The apparition was not violent, but its presence was a relentless force that shook me to the core. I realized in that moment that this was not merely a haunting. It was a confrontation with my own guilt, my failures, and my inability to mend what was broken. With the storm raging outside and my inner turmoil reaching a fever pitch, I knew I had to face these ghosts head-on. I forced myself to step outside the relative safety of the RV, letting the deluge wash over me as I walked toward a clearing where the wind had momentarily subsided. The rain blurred my vision, but I could make out shapes moving in the periphery, a dance of shadows that felt both mournful and accusatory. There, in the midst of the storm, I confronted the spectral figure once more. The apparition of my estranged spouse circled me, her eyes filled with an intensity that mirrored my own internal anguish. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, drenched and shivering, as the wind carried our voices together in a surreal chorus of sorrow and regret. "I'm sorry," I found myself shouting into the storm, my voice cracking with emotion. "I failed you. I failed myself. I never had the courage to fight for what mattered." My words, raw and unfiltered, were carried away by the wind, but they felt like a declaration, a promise to no longer hide from the pain of my past. As I spoke, the spectral figures around me began to shift. The silhouettes of lost loved ones, the echoes of old regrets, all seemed to gather in a silent communion. In that climactic moment, I realized that the supernatural manifestations were not enemies to be vanquished. They were a mirror, reflecting the unresolved parts of my soul. The storm, the isolation, and the ghostly whispers were all part of a journey toward healing. Slowly, the intensity of the apparition softened. The sorrow in her eyes gave way to a quiet resignation, as if acknowledging that my apology was the first step toward forgiveness, even if it was only self-forgiveness. The storm began to recede, the torrential rain easing into a gentle drizzle. I felt, for the first time in a long while, a fragile sense of hope emerging from the depths of despair. In the pale light of dawn, I returned to my RV, exhausted yet oddly liberated. The storm had passed, leaving behind a forest that looked both familiar and transformed. I inspected the vehicle. Its engine was still temperamental, its electrical system barely clinging to life, but now it symbolized my own battered resilience. I managed to coax it back into a semblance of working order, a small victory that felt like the beginning of something new. I spent the rest of the morning quietly gathering my thoughts. The supernatural encounters had subsided, though their echoes still lingered in the silent corners of my mind. I found the mysterious mementos, the photograph, the handwritten note, the small locket, and realized that while they had been unsettling at first, they were reminders that I was not entirely alone in my journey. Others, too, had walked this path of regret and redemption before me, and their traces whispered that healing was possible, however painful it might be. As I prepared to leave the campsite later that day, I took one last look at the forest. The trees stood tall and unyielding, ancient witnesses to the struggles of countless souls. I felt a deep, abiding respect for the wild, a respect born not only of its beauty, but also of its ability to force even the most broken of hearts to confront the truth. I left the clearing with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of that stormy night would not vanish overnight. But I had taken the first steps toward forgiveness, toward understanding that my past did not have to define my future. The supernatural encounters, the ghostly apparitions, and the relentless whispers were no longer threats. They were part of the process of healing, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is the potential for light. Now, as I continue my journey along the winding roads of the Ouachita National Forest, I carry with me the lessons learned in that storm. The echoes of my past are still there, but they no longer hold me captive. I've learned that sometimes the most daunting battles are fought not against external forces, but within the confines of our own hearts. And while the forest may still whisper its secrets in the wind, I no longer fear the unknown. I face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that redemption is possible, even for a man as broken as I once was. I know that the ghosts of that night will continue to visit me in quiet moments, memories that surface when I least expect them. Yet, I also know that I have the strength to endure, to rebuild, and to forge a new path forward. My journey is far from over, but every mile I drive brings me closer to a future where regret is replaced by hope, and the silent voices of the past become gentle echoes rather than relentless wails. This is my story, a tale of isolation, supernatural encounters, and the painful yet necessary path to redemption. My name is Michael Carter, and at 45 I finally learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the darkness within and let the light in. My name is Caleb Morrison. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma, a place where ancient legends and modern miseries converge into a nightmare I never imagined possible. I had planned our weekend RV trip as a break from the relentless grind of city life. After suffering a string of personal setbacks, I needed time to regroup, to find solace in nature. My friends, Sam Reyes, Bryce Carter, and Lila Thompson, agreed to join me. We loaded up my old, rattling RV, an aging relic that had seen better days. Even from the start, the vehicle groaned in protest, its engine wheezing as if it sensed the ominous journey ahead. We set out early on a crisp Friday morning, excitement and trepidation mixing in the air. Sam, ever the adventurer with an almost mystical intuition for danger, was already urging us to embrace every moment. Bryce, our resident skeptic, rolled his eyes at anything remotely supernatural, quipping that nature could only be as scary as we made it. Lila, sensitive and quietly anxious, had been scribbling notes in her battered journal, her mind half lost in local folklore and half in worry. The roads were rough, and our GPS soon proved unreliable. We followed outdated maps and local directions, winding deeper into the heart of the Wichita Mountains. The scenery was breathtaking. Jagged rock formations, dense woodlands, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow the normal sounds of civilization. Yet, as we progressed, the once inviting wilderness began to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. That first evening, as dusk settled over the rugged landscape, we parked in a secluded clearing. The trees around us were ancient, their gnarled branches casting long, sinister shadows. I remember stepping out of the RV and noticing peculiar scratch-like symbols carved into the trunks of several trees. They resembled Native American petroglyphs, worn smooth by time, and for a moment, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the natural decay of the forest. It was as if someone, or something, had deliberately marked these trees with a warning. "Do you guys see these?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sam crouched beside me, her eyes scanning the markings with a mix of curiosity and concern. "They're like something out of a legend," she whispered. Bryce snorted, dismissing our unease with a sarcastic remark about local art projects, but even he couldn't hide a hint of discomfort. Night deepened, and we settled around a small fire outside the RV. The wind had died, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Lila's voice, usually soft and tentative, broke the silence. "I keep hearing something," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "It's like whispers. I can't make out the words, but they sound ancient." We all listened intently, straining to catch any sound. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves. Then, faintly, I heard it too, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath us. The sound was almost musical, yet laden with sorrow and menace. It sent a shiver up my spine and made me wonder if the legends Lila had been researching were more than mere stories. Sleep did not come easily that night. I spent hours awake, glancing over at my friends, their faces lit by the flickering firelight, each lost in their own troubled thoughts. I reassured myself that it was only the isolation and the quirks of an old RV playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I felt that something was very wrong. The next morning, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken dread. We resumed our journey, our banter subdued. As we drove along a narrow, winding road, the RV's engine sputtered and eventually died, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. The malfunction wasn't entirely unexpected given the vehicle's age, but the timing couldn't have been worse. We were miles from any town, with a storm threatening on the horizon. We huddled around the RV as dark clouds gathered overhead. Bryce, ever the cynic, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his voice faltered as thunder rumbled in the distance. Sam, however, grew increasingly agitated. "Something's not right," she insisted, her eyes darting to the dark tree line bordering the road. "I feel like we're trespassing on something sacred." Lila, clutching her journal like a lifeline, murmured, "I read about a curse in these parts. Something about an ancient spirit that guards the land." Her words, though quiet, carried a weight of dread that settled over us all. I couldn't help but recall the scratch marks from the previous night. Now, more than a simple curiosity, they were an omen. As the storm broke, rain pounded the landscape, turning the road into a slick, treacherous path. We attempted to call for help on our barely functioning cell phones, but the signal was non-existent in this remote wilderness. With no other choice, we decided to set up camp again, this time in a small clearing near a cluster of ancient pines. That night, the oppressive feeling returned with a vengeance. I awoke to a series of ghostly whispers, distant, disjointed voices speaking in an indigenous tongue that I couldn't understand. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it must be the wind, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Outside my makeshift shelter, I caught sight of a shifting figure moving among the trees. It wasn't quite human. Its form was fluid, as if it were made of the shadows themselves. I bolted awake, heart pounding, and nudged Sam awake. "Do you see that?" I whispered urgently. Sam's eyes widened, and for the first time, Bryce's usual bravado faltered. We peered into the darkness together, but the figure had vanished, leaving behind only the eerie echo of its passage. The following day, with the storm having passed but the atmosphere still thick with dread, we decided to press on. Our destination was a remote ridge known for its panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness, a spot that, according to local lore, was once a sacred ground for indigenous peoples. Lila's research had revealed that the land was said to be cursed, guarded by a vengeful spirit born from ancient transgressions against the natural world. As we climbed the ridge, the group's tensions became palpable. Bryce's sarcastic retorts clashed with Sam's earnest warnings, and even I struggled to keep our collective fear in check. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shifting shadow, felt like a prelude to an attack. I could see the strain in Lila's eyes as she clutched her journal, her mind racing through the pages of forbidden lore. Reaching the summit, we were greeted by a breathtaking, if unsettling, vista. The expanse of the Wichita Mountains stretched out before us, its rugged beauty marred by an undercurrent of menace. It was here, amidst the whispering winds and craggy outcrops, that the true horror began. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dipped low, we discovered remnants of a ritual site, a circle of weathered stones arranged in a pattern that spoke of ancient ceremonies. Symbols similar to those we had seen on the trees were etched into the stones. Lila's voice trembled as she explained, "This was a place of power. I believe the spirit here is a manifestation of a curse, a vengeful guardian of this sacred land. According to Cherokee legends, outsiders who disturb the balance are doomed to suffer." Her words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. I could sense the change in the atmosphere immediately. The wind picked up, carrying with it a mournful sound that resembled a dirge. Sam's eyes shone with a mix of determination and terror. "We need to leave," she urged, her tone resolute. But Bryce scoffed, insisting that it was all just superstition, a remnant of old stories meant to scare tourists. Before we could decide on a course of action, the ground trembled beneath our feet. A deep, resonant growl emanated from the forest, and in that moment, the creature revealed itself. Emerging from the darkness was a figure that defied explanation, a grotesque hybrid of man and beast, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fury. It moved with a predatory grace that belied its monstrous form, its body contorted in unnatural ways. I felt a cold, primal fear grip my heart as I realized we were not merely trespassers, but the targets of something far more sinister. The creature, an embodiment of the ancient curse, attacked with brutal force. In the ensuing chaos, Bryce's skepticism turned to frantic terror as he was struck by a glancing blow that left him bleeding. Sam shouted for him to run, her voice cracking with panic as she scrambled to help him. Lila, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, clutched her journal as if it could shield her from the nightmare unfolding around us. I instinctively took charge, barking orders as we retreated toward the safety of the ridge's rocky outcrops. "We need to regroup and find a way to fend it off," I shouted, my mind racing as I tried to recall every scrap of local lore Lila had mentioned. The creature was relentless, its attacks growing more savage with each passing moment. It wasn't content with merely harassing us. It was out for blood, driven by an ancient, unquenchable hunger for retribution. In the ensuing melee, our old RV, our only semblance of security, became both a refuge and a prison. The creature circled it like a predator stalking its prey, hissing and clawing at its rusted frame. At one point, as I peered out of a grimy window, I saw the reflection of a gaunt, skeletal face staring back at me. a visage that resembled the ancient legends of a cursed spirit. The sight nearly broke my resolve. With Bryce bleeding and Sam struggling to keep her composure, I realized that brute force alone wouldn't save us. I remembered a passage in Lila's notes about ancient rituals, suggestions of using salt, fire, and offerings to appease the spirit and create a barrier against its malevolence. "Lila, can you remember anything else from those legends?" I demanded, even as my own body trembled with fear. Through tear-filled eyes, she recalled a ritual of restitution, a way to honor the sacred land and, perhaps, placate the vengeful spirit. "We need to gather salt, light a fire around the perimeter, and offer something from our hearts. It may be our only chance," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the creature's howls. We scavenged what supplies we could from the RV, a bag of salt, some matches, and even a small portable radio that still miraculously worked. Working quickly, we set about creating a defensive circle around the RV. Sam took charge of lighting the fire, her hands steady despite the terror in her eyes, while I helped Bryce and Lila arrange the salt around us in a rough perimeter. The ritual was improvised, desperate, and steeped in an ancient respect we barely understood. As the flames roared to life, the creature paused at the edge of our circle. It stood there, a hulking mass of twisted flesh and unholy intent, its eyes fixed on us with a malevolent intelligence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I could feel the weight of centuries of anger and sorrow pressing down on us, the culmination of ancient grievances unleashed upon modern trespassers. Then, as if enraged by our defiance, the creature surged forward. The ensuing struggle was a blur of frantic shouts, desperate movements, and the crackle of the fire. Sam screamed as the beast slammed into the circle, its claws raking at the ground. Bryce's blood stained the earth, and I felt an icy, paralyzing pain as the creature's foul breath brushed against my skin. Yet, amidst the chaos, the fire seemed to push it back, its flames acting as a barrier between us and the relentless curse. In that final harrowing confrontation, the creature howled in fury and pain before retreating into the darkness from whence it came. The circle of fire remained our fragile shield, and as dawn broke over the mountains, we were left to count our losses. Bryce's wound was severe, and despite our efforts, he succumbed to his injuries shortly after. His death was a bitter blow, a stark reminder that survival in these cursed lands came at an unthinkable price. In the days that followed, we managed to limp our way back to civilization, forever marked by the horror we had encountered. The Wichita Mountains had revealed a terrifying secret, a curse born of ancient transgressions and nurtured by the blood of those who dared disturb its resting place. Each of us was haunted by the memory of that monstrous entity and the desperate rituals we had performed in a futile bid for survival. For me, the experience changed everything. I had always believed in rational explanations, but that night forced me to confront the possibility that some legends are rooted in a truth too terrible to ignore. Sam, once so fearless and adventurous, now carries an unspoken sorrow in her eyes, a constant reminder of the evil that lurks in the shadows of our modern world. Lila, whose passion for folklore once shone with creativity, now writes with a mournful tone, as if trying to document a warning for those who might follow in our footsteps. And Bryce, I still see his skeptical smile in my dreams, a ghostly reminder of the cost of disbelief. In the aftermath, I returned to the mountains alone, seeking answers and perhaps a measure of redemption. I spent countless hours at local libraries and speaking with indigenous elders, piecing together the fragments of an ancient story, a tale of land, loss, and a spirit that defied time. I learned that our intrusion had been seen as a violation, a disturbance of a sacred trust between the land and its guardians. The markings on the trees, the ritual site at the ridge, even the creature that had nearly ended our lives, were all echoes of a deeper, older conflict, a warning from the past. Even now, as I sit in the dim light of my study, I can still hear the faint, mournful whispers of the wind, a reminder of that cursed weekend and the dark power that still lingers in the Wichita Mountains. The experience taught me that survival isn't just about escaping physical harm, it's about understanding and respecting the forces that have shaped this land long before any of us arrived. I write this account not to seek sympathy, but to honor the memory of my fallen friend, and to caution anyone who might be tempted by the allure of the wild. There are secrets in these forests that are best left undisturbed, ancient voices that should not be ignored. And as the firelight of that desperate night still flickers in my mind, I know that the curse of the Wichita Mountains is far from laid to rest. It waits, ever vigilant, for the next intruder to test its wrath. That terrifying weekend transformed us all. We were no longer merely urbanites seeking adventure. We had become witnesses to a timeless horror, irrevocably changed by the forces of nature and spirit. And though I try to live my life with the normalcy of a man who has seen too much, I can never shake the feeling that, in the dark corners of the world, ancient powers still hold sway, a truth that, once known, can never be forgotten. My name is Caleb Morrison, and if you ever find yourself drawn to the wild majesty of the Wichita Mountains, remember that some legends are real and some curses are eternal. My name is Julia Black. I'm 28 years old, and this happened in the dense whispering forests around Medicine Creek, Oklahoma. I had reached a breaking point, emotionally shattered from a past that clung to me like a suffocating fog, and decided that a solo RV journey into isolation might be the salve I so desperately needed. I hoped that in the vast, untouched wilderness I might find solace, clarity, and perhaps a way to finally leave behind the shadows of my abusive past. I drove an old RV, a battered relic that I'd inherited from a distant relative. It rattled along the winding country roads, its engine groaning under the strain of age and neglect. Despite its many faults, the failing electronics, the temperamental engine, and a persistent series of small breakdowns, I clung to it like a lifeline. I had no cell phone signal deep in the forest, which only served to heighten the isolation I craved. As I pulled off the highway onto a narrow, gravelly road that led towards Medicine Creek, I felt both excitement and a twinge of dread. Something about the area whispered of forgotten histories and hidden secrets. I set up camp near a small clearing at the edge of a forest that seemed to breathe with an ancient life of its own. The first night was eerily silent. I arranged a modest fire outside the RV and sat on a creaking fold-out chair, trying to shake off the unease that prickled along my skin. The silence, at first comforting in its simplicity, soon became oppressive. As the darkness deepened, I noticed faint scratches on the interior walls of the RV, scratches that hadn't been there when I'd parked. They were shallow, almost childlike in their execution, as though some tiny, desperate hand had tried to communicate with me. I brushed them off as the work of my imagination, spurred by my frayed nerves and the isolation of the wilderness. As the night wore on, I began to hear it, a series of soft, almost childlike giggles that floated in on the wind, mingling with the rustle of leaves. The sound was subtle at first, but it grew steadily louder, an echo of laughter that sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than the wind teasing the branches, yet a deep, instinctual fear told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The following morning, while sipping weak coffee by the RV's grimy window, I ventured into the nearby forest to gather some firewood. As I walked along a narrow trail, I noticed odd symbols etched into the bark of several trees, swirling lines and cryptic marks that resembled Native American petroglyphs. They seemed deliberate, as though someone had chosen these trees for a specific purpose. A sense of foreboding crept over me. I recalled an encounter at a deserted service station earlier that day, where an elderly local had warned me in a hushed, raspy tone about the whispering curse of Medicine Creek. He spoke of a witch, a wronged woman from long ago whose spirit was said to wander these woods, accompanied by ghostly children, seeking vengeance for an injustice that had never been righted. That warning lodged itself in my mind as I returned to the RV. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. I couldn't shake the feeling that the scratches on the walls were somehow connected to the symbols outside. Later that afternoon, I resolved to explore further. I grabbed my flashlight and a worn notebook, determined to document every odd occurrence, every anomaly that defied logical explanation. Venturing off the beaten path, I soon found myself at the outskirts of an abandoned cabin nestled deep among the trees. The structure was dilapidated, its wooden walls sagging and covered in creeping ivy, its windows long shattered. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding in a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Inside, the air was stale and cold, and scattered about were relics of a forgotten past. A bundle of dried herbs tied with a frayed ribbon, a tarnished locket with an inscription I couldn't quite read, and yellowed newspaper clippings detailing the trial of a local woman accused of witchcraft. The clippings described her as a kind soul who was driven to the edge by the cruelty of her community, a woman who had been brutally punished for daring to stand against injustice. My mind raced as I realized that this cabin might have once belonged to her, or been a sanctuary in her memory. I spent the rest of the day poring over the relics, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that seemed as tragic as it was mysterious. As twilight fell and I returned to the RV, the forest around me had transformed. The once gentle rustling of leaves now sounded like hushed whispers. The wind seemed to carry voices that spoke in a language both ancient and sorrowful. That night, as I sat by the fire, the giggles I'd heard before returned, softer now, yet imbued with an unmistakable note of desperation. I tried to focus on the crackle of the flames, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. They echoed around the RV, sometimes right at the window, and then would vanish when I looked outside. At one point, I swore I saw a small, shadowy figure dart past the glass, its form indistinct and fleeting. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister. Sleep was a distant memory that night as I lay awake, heart pounding and eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond. The following day brought little relief. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the unease gnawed at me. I decided to take another walk, hoping that some fresh air and the familiarity of the forest might calm my racing thoughts. As I ambled along a narrow path, I encountered a small clearing that housed the remnants of an old ritual site. In the center lay a circle of stones, each one weathered by time and marked with the same cryptic symbols I'd seen on the trees. The scene felt heavy with a past that refused to be forgotten. Overwhelmed by a mixture of fear and empathy, I sat in the circle and opened my notebook. I scribbled down my observations, trying to reconcile the ghostly children's laughter with the tragic story of the wronged witch. The more I wrote, the more I felt that the forest was speaking to me, a dialogue between the living and the lost. It was as if the ghostly presence was not merely a malevolent force, but a manifestation of unhealed wounds and unresolved grief. That evening, as a violent storm rolled in, I huddled inside the RV. The rain pounded against the metal exterior, and lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the darkness with stark, surreal clarity. Amid the cacophony of nature's fury, I heard it again, a clear, sorrowful voice, female and laden with centuries of pain. It was coming from just outside the RV, a low, haunting murmur that seemed to call my name. I crept to the window, my heart thundering in my chest, and strained to see through the torrential downpour. In the brief flashes of lightning, I caught a glimpse of a spectral figure, a woman in tattered clothes, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes filled with a mournful intensity. For a moment our eyes met, and I felt as though she was pleading with me, begging for me to understand her sorrow. I couldn't move. Paralyzed by a mix of terror and compassion, I watched as she slowly faded back into the darkness. The storm raged on, but inside the RV, the oppressive silence was replaced by the echo of her words, a whispered lament that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the vehicle. In that moment, I realized that the curse of Medicine Creek was not solely an external force. It was also a mirror reflecting my own inner pain, a reminder that the ghosts of the past, both hers and mine, needed to be confronted before I could truly find peace. In the days that followed, the boundary between the tangible and the supernatural blurred. I began to experience vivid hallucinations, moments when the past and the present collided. I'd see brief flashes of a younger version of the witch, radiant and kind, before the cruelty of her fate had darkened her spirit. Sometimes, as I walked through the forest, I felt as though invisible hands were brushing against my skin, as though the very trees were trying to communicate their secrets. The spirit of the witch grew bolder. One night, I awoke to the sound of soft footsteps circling the RV. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. Mustering every ounce of courage, I stepped outside into the storm. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the rain soaked me to the bone. In the flickering beam of my flashlight, I saw her again. The spectral woman standing in the doorway of the abandoned cabin. Her face now clear enough to see the sorrow etched into every line. She spoke in a whisper that mingled grief with accusation. "You carry the pain, child. Only by facing it can you set us free." Her eyes bore into mine, and in that moment I understood that my journey was intertwined with her curse. The forest, the ghostly children's laughter, the mysterious symbols, they were all pieces of a puzzle that demanded resolution. Desperate for answers, I scoured the remnants of the cabin for clues. I learned that the witch, whose name had been lost to time, had been a healer and a seer. Wronged by the very people she sought to help, she had been condemned and forced to bear the weight of her torment long after death. Her spirit, fueled by an unending sorrow and a need for justice, had become bound to Medicine Creek, her presence manifesting in the whispers of the wind and the giggles of unseen children. The ghostly children, I surmised, were echoes of those who had suffered alongside her, a tragic chorus of innocence lost. Determined to break the cycle of sorrow and anger, I resolved to perform a makeshift ritual of restitution, one that might finally lay the curse to rest. I gathered the few relics I had found, the locket, the dried herbs, even the faded clippings, and returned to the stone circle. In the quiet of a moonlit night, with the remnants of the storm still echoing in the distance, I arranged them in the center of the circle. I recalled the old local wisdom I had been given, that healing comes only when the wounds of the past are acknowledged, when forgiveness is extended both to oneself and to those who have long been forgotten. With trembling hands, I sprinkled salt around the circle, creating a boundary meant to purify and protect. I lit a small fire in the center, its flames dancing in the cool night air. As I began to speak, my voice shaky yet resolute, I recounted the tragedy of the wronged witch, not with anger, but with empathy and sorrow. I offered words of forgiveness both for her and for myself, as I acknowledged the pain we both carried. The air seemed to vibrate with an almost tangible energy, as if the forest itself was listening, waiting for something to change. For several agonizing minutes, I felt the presence of 1,000 unseen eyes. The spectral children appeared once more, their faces no longer twisted with mischief, but softened with a longing for peace. The ghostly woman, standing at the edge of the circle, watched silently. And then, as if a great weight had been lifted, the oppressive energy that had haunted Medicine Creek began to dissipate. The wind's mournful whisper softened to a gentle sigh, and the relentless knockings on the RV's walls became a distant memory. I cannot say whether the curse was completely lifted that night, but I knew that something had changed. The forest, once a realm of relentless sorrow, felt lighter, as though the burden of old grief had finally been acknowledged. I left Medicine Creek with a heart that was still heavy with memories, yet hopeful for the first time in years. I had faced not only the supernatural manifestations of a long-forgotten injustice, but also the demons of my own past. In doing so, I found the strength to forgive, to heal, and to move forward. Now, as I write these words from the quiet sanctuary of my small apartment, I often recall that fateful journey. Medicine Creek taught me that the most profound horrors are not always the ones that threaten our physical lives, but those that linger within our hearts. The spectral whispers and ghostly apparitions were, in their own way, a call to confront the unresolved pain of a world that had long neglected to mend its wounds. I realized that healing, both personal and communal, requires a willingness to acknowledge and honor the past, however painful it may be. My journey in that old RV was more than an escape from a toxic relationship. It was a pilgrimage into the depths of my own soul, where the echoes of ancient grief met the scars of modern heartbreak. I discovered that sometimes, in the silence of a forgotten forest, one can find the courage to rewrite one's own story. And as I move forward with a newfound sense of purpose, I carry with me the lessons learned from a haunted past and a promise that even the deepest curses can be transformed through understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. The whispering winds of Medicine Creek no longer call to me with despair, but with a gentle reminder that every soul, no matter how burdened, has the capacity to heal. And though I still sometimes hear the faint laughter of unseen children on quiet nights, I now know that it is not a sound of terror, but a soft, bittersweet lullaby of hope, urging me onward into a future where the past is not forgotten, but embraced as part of the tapestry of who I have become. My name is Julia Black, and that journey in Medicine Creek transformed me in ways I am still coming to understand. It showed me that even in the midst of isolation and sorrow, there is the possibility of renewal, that the scars we carry can someday guide us toward the light. My name is Michael Mike Carter. I'm 45 years old, and this is the story of a journey that forced me to confront the ghosts of my past, both literal and metaphorical, in the depths of the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. This happened one autumn when I left behind a life full of regret, estrangement, and unresolved pain, hoping that the solitude of the forest and the isolation of my old RV would help me find a path to redemption. I left my city apartment on a chilly Friday morning, my battered RV loaded with nothing more than essential belongings, a few mementos of a better time, and a heart weighed down by years of regret. The road stretched out ahead of me like an unwritten promise, a chance to atone for past mistakes and rebuild a life that had long been in ruins. I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeking. Perhaps it was forgiveness, perhaps a way to silence the relentless voices of self-blame. All I knew was that I needed to escape, The RV, an aging relic that had seen better days, sputtered as I pulled onto the highway. Its engine coughed and wheezed, and I couldn't help but draw a parallel between its condition and my own battered soul. Every flicker of the dashboard light and every creak of the frame reminded me that I was venturing into territory where neither man nor machine was guaranteed to perform as expected. I pressed on, driving deeper into the wild, letting the hum of the engine drown out the memories that so often haunted me. Not long after entering the forest's fringes, my RV began to show signs of failing. The electrical system stuttered, and the lights inside the vehicle flickered unpredictably. I pulled over by the roadside to inspect the damage, feeling an unsettling sense of vulnerability. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring with fate to force me to slow down, to face what lay ahead rather than rush blindly forward. I managed a temporary fix, but the lingering worry that my escape might be interrupted never left me. That first night in a clearing near a meandering dirt road, I set up camp under a canopy of ancient trees. The silence was profound, a silence so deep it almost seemed to swallow every thought. As darkness fell, the forest took on a different personality. Shadows shifted in ways that made me question whether I was truly alone. A sudden gust of wind rattled the RV's thin walls, and for a moment I thought I heard soft murmurs that could have been the wind or something else. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as I crawled into the small, creaky bed of the RV, but sleep eluded me. Every creak and whisper outside sent my mind spiraling back to memories of lost love and broken promises. I remembered my estranged spouse, the words we'd left unsaid, and the child I'd once held so tenderly. In the darkness, the line between memory and hallucination blurred, and I wondered if the forest was somehow tapping into my innermost regrets. The next morning, I awoke to a mist that blanketed the forest in a ghostly haze. As I stepped outside, the chill in the air seemed to seep into my bones. I began my routine of checking the RV and exploring the immediate surroundings, hoping that the fresh daylight would clear the fog of my troubled thoughts. That's when I found it. A faded photograph, partially hidden beneath a cluster of wildflowers just a few feet from my parked vehicle. The photograph was of a family, smiling and united, a stark contrast to the disintegration of my own. On the back, a handwritten note read, "You are not alone in your journey." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Had someone left this for me? It was as if the forest had offered a small, cryptic gesture of empathy, or perhaps a warning. I pocketed the photograph and note, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, guided, or even tested by forces beyond my understanding. Throughout the day, I began to notice other oddities. There were personal mementos scattered near my campsite. An old key, a small locket, even a scrap of paper with words that I couldn't quite make out. These items, relics of past lives, seemed to resonate with my own history of pain and loss. I started to wonder if these were simply remnants left behind by previous wanderers, or if the forest was somehow curating a collection of memories meant to confront me with my own demons. As dusk approached on my second night, the forest transformed into something out of a dream or a nightmare. The air grew heavy, and the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were replaced by distant echoes that resembled the voices of loved ones I had lost. I sat by the RV's window, clutching a worn photograph of my daughter, when I saw them. Faint, ghostly silhouettes drifting between the trees. They were ephemeral and indistinct, but each time I blinked, I felt like I was catching a glimpse of someone I knew, an echo of the past that refused to be forgotten. At first, I rationalized these visions as tricks of the light and the power of suggestion. But as the nights wore on, the apparitions grew more vivid. One evening, in the midst of a sudden downpour, a translucent figure appeared outside my RV. The shape of a person, a woman perhaps, stood silently in the rain. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, met mine for a moment before she faded away like mist. I couldn't help but feel that she embodied every regret and missed chance in my life, an echo of the relationships I had let crumble under the weight of my own failures. The apparitions didn't bring terror in the conventional sense. Rather, they stirred up a deep, unsettling melancholy. Their presence was a constant reminder that the past was inescapable, that my guilt and sorrow were intertwined with the very fabric of the forest. I began to understand that these supernatural manifestations were not malicious. They were manifestations of my own inner turmoil, dredging up the pain I had long tried to suppress. Midway through my journey, the weather took a turn for the worse. A sudden, violent storm swept in, trapping me near my RV as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the metal walls. The RV, already struggling with its aging engine and faltering electrical system, shuddered under the onslaught of nature. Communication devices failed, and I was completely cut off from the outside world. It was just me, the storm, and the oppressive silence punctuated only by the howling wind. Inside the RV, the atmosphere grew stifling and claustrophobic. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was utterly isolated, both physically and emotionally. In that solitude, the ghostly encounters intensified. The whispers outside took on a new urgency, as if urging me to confront the demons that I had been running from for so long. Every flash of lightning revealed fleeting images, faces of people I'd hurt, regrets that I couldn't erase, and memories that clamored for acknowledgement. At the height of the storm, when the wind and rain seemed to merge into a single, relentless force, I experienced the most vivid apparition of all. In the flickering light of a makeshift candle, I saw a figure that resembled my estranged spouse, a spectral mirror of my past. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow, disappointment, and an almost pleading intensity. In a voice that seemed to come from both far away and right beside me, she whispered, "Why did you let go? Why didn't you fight for us?" I staggered back, overwhelmed by the raw surge of emotion. The apparition was not violent, but its presence was a relentless force that shook me to the core. I realized in that moment that this was not merely a haunting. It was a confrontation with my own guilt, my failures, and my inability to mend what was broken. With the storm raging outside and my inner turmoil reaching a fever pitch, I knew I had to face these ghosts head on. I forced myself to step outside the relative safety of the RV, letting the deluge wash over me as I walked toward a clearing where the wind had momentarily subsided. The rain blurred my vision, but I could make out shapes moving in the periphery, a dance of shadows that felt both mournful and accusatory. There, in the midst of the storm, I confronted the spectral figure once more. The apparition of my estranged spouse circled me, her eyes filled with an intensity that mirrored my own internal anguish. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, drenched and shivering, as the wind carried our voices together in a surreal chorus of sorrow and regret. "I'm sorry," I found myself shouting into the storm, my voice cracking with emotion. "I failed you. I failed myself. I never had the courage to fight for what mattered." My words, raw and unfiltered, were carried away by the wind, but they felt like a declaration, a promise to no longer hide from the pain of my past. As I spoke, the spectral figures around me began to shift. The silhouettes of lost loved ones, the echoes of old regrets, all seemed to gather in a silent communion. In that climactic moment, I realized that the supernatural manifestations were not enemies to be vanquished. They were a mirror, reflecting the unresolved parts of my soul. The storm, the isolation, and the ghostly whispers were all part of a journey toward healing. Slowly, the intensity of the apparition softened. The sorrow in her eyes gave way to a quiet resignation, as if acknowledging that my apology was the first step toward forgiveness, even if it was only self-forgiveness. The storm began to recede, the torrential rain easing into a gentle drizzle. I felt, for the first time in a long while, a fragile sense of hope emerging from the depths of despair. In the pale light of dawn, I returned to my RV, exhausted yet oddly liberated. The storm had passed, leaving behind a forest that looked both familiar and transformed. I inspected the vehicle. Its engine was still temperamental, its electrical system barely clinging to life. But now, it symbolized my own battered resilience. I managed to coax it back into a semblance of working order, a small victory that felt like the beginning of something new. I spent the rest of the morning quietly gathering my thoughts. The supernatural encounters had subsided, though their echoes still lingered in the silent corners of my mind. I found the mysterious mementos, the photograph, the handwritten note, the small locket, and realized that while they had been unsettling at first, they were reminders that I was not entirely alone in my journey. Others, too, had walked this path of regret and redemption before me, and their traces whispered that healing was possible, however painful it might be. As I prepared to leave the campsite later that day, I took one last look at the forest. The trees stood tall and unyielding, ancient witnesses to the struggles of countless souls. I felt a deep, abiding respect for the wild. A respect born not only of its beauty, but also of its ability to force even the most broken of hearts to confront the truth. I left the clearing with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of that stormy night would not vanish overnight. But I had taken the first steps toward forgiveness, toward understanding that my past did not have to define my future. The supernatural encounters, the ghostly apparitions, and the relentless whispers were no longer threats. They were part of the process of healing, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is the potential for light. Now, as I continue my journey along the winding roads of the Ouachita National Forest, I carry with me the lessons learned in that storm. The echoes of my past are still there, but they no longer hold me captive. I've learned that sometimes the most daunting battles are fought not against external forces, but within the confines of our own hearts. And while the forest may still whisper its secrets in the wind, I no longer fear the unknown. I face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that redemption is possible, even for a man as broken as I once was. I know that the ghosts of that night will continue to visit me in quiet moments, memories that surface when I least expect them. Yet, I also know that I have the strength to endure, to rebuild, and to forge a new path forward. My journey is far from over, but every mile I drive brings me closer to a future where regret is replaced by hope, and the silent voices of the past become gentle echoes rather than relentless wails. This is my story, a tale of isolation, supernatural encounters, and the painful yet necessary path to redemption. My name is Michael Carter, and at 45 I finally learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the darkness within and let the light in.